Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're drifting into a world of powdered wigs turned to natural curls, of starched linen and impossible boots, of men who treated getting dressed as a full-time occupation and somehow convinced an entire nation to take them seriously for it. We're heading into Regency, England, into the strange, glittering, faintly ridiculous kingdom of the dandy. Before we settle in, thank you to everyone who keeps sending in topic suggestions. I read all of them, and tonight's journey exists because enough of you asked for it. If you're the sort of person who likes to drift off somewhere between chapters, that's exactly what this is built for. No need to do anything at all, just let the words carry you. If you'd rather listen without a screen glowing at you, this show is on Spotify too, and there's a longer, ad-free cut waiting for those who support the channel directly. Now turn the lights down low, let a fan hum quietly somewhere in the room, and get comfortable. We have a great deal of ground to cover, and none of it needs to be rushed. Let's start with a few questions worth turning over slowly in your mind. What would it take to make idleness look like the hardest job in London? Could you survive a morning built entirely around a single piece of white cloth tied around your throat? Would you risk your entire fortune for the privilege of being admired by people you privately despised? What happens to a man whose whole identity rests on the crease of a coat and the shine of a boot? And is it truly possible to insult the most powerful man in the country and walk away laughing, at least for a while? You're about to find out, because you've just woken up in a set of rented rooms somewhere off Piccadilly in the year 1814, with a headache you earned honestly, a stack of unopened bills you have been very deliberately ignoring, and a valet standing in the doorway with an expression that suggests today's shirt has already disappointed him. Welcome to fashionable London. Try to look as though you belong here. Let's begin at the beginning, in the room where every dandy's day quietly started, long before anyone else was watching. You surface slowly, the way anyone does after a night that involved a great deal of wine and even more talking. The light through the curtains is the pale, filtered gray particular to London mornings, thick with coal smoke drifting in from 1,000 chimneys across the city. There is no farm rooster here, no bell tolling you awake. There is only your valet, standing a polite distance from the bed, already forming opinions about your hair that he has not yet chosen to share aloud. Here is the peculiar truth of your situation. You may not have 2 coins to rub together by the standards of a real fortune. You may, in fact, be living on credit stretched thinner than the muslin at your throat. And yet, for the next several hours, this modest bedchamber will function as something closer to a temple, and you are the efficient conducting your own daily ceremony of becoming presentable. Look around the room properly, because it is working very hard to tell a story on your behalf. A washstand holds a porcelain basin. A tall glass has been angled just so to catch the best of the weak morning light. A wardrobe stands crowded with more coats than any reasonable man could require, each one a small monument to a tailor's patience and an unpaid bill. Nothing in this room is cheap, and very little of it, if we are honest, has actually been paid for. Your chambers are a stage set, dressed for an audience, and you are the leading man in a production that could be cancelled at any moment by a landlord who has finally lost patience. The address itself matters more than almost anything else about you. A fashionable street signals fashionable credentials the way certain neighborhoods do today, regardless of what's actually inside the building. Live on the wrong side of a particular square and no tailoring in the world will fully rescue your standing. Live on the right one, even crammed into 2 narrow rooms above a hatter's shop, and London will politely agree to overlook the details. Your address does a great deal of quiet lying for you, and it lies well. Notice, too, that you will not be alone for long despite waking up that way. The dandy's morning was, strangely enough, a semi-public event. Friends dropped by uninvited to watch the proceedings. Your valet hovered constantly. Occasionally, a tradesman knocked, and you learned quickly to recognize the particular rhythm of a knock belonging to someone you owed money. Imagine being unable to fully begin your day until a small audience had gathered to observe you doing it, something like a broadcast nobody asked you to start, but everybody had come to expect. Your head, meanwhile, is registering its objections. Last night involved cards, a truly alarming quantity of claret, and conversation so witty you can only reconstruct about half of it this morning. The reckoning for all three is arriving now, in your skull, and less immediately but more seriously on the writing desk, where a small tower of unopened letters sits waiting. You already know who they're from. You are choosing, for now, not to know what they say. A dandy, however, does not groan, does not press a hand to his temple, does not admit, even to himself, that last night might have been a mistake. He rises with the total, unbothered calm of a man who has never once erred in judgment, which is a genuinely impressive performance given the evidence stacked in plain view. And so the day begins, not with anything so sensible as water and a moment to collect yourself, but with a long look in the mirror and a decision to begin becoming, once again, effortless. As you're about to discover, effortlessness may be the single hardest thing a man can manufacture. It's time to get dressed, and I'd encourage you to settle in because this is not a quick affair. We tend to think of a morning routine as something that takes 10 or 15 minutes and involves, at most, a cup of coffee and mild self-recrimination. For a Regency gentleman of fashion, the toilette, the full ritual of washing, grooming, and dressing, could easily eat up the better part of a morning, and for the truly devoted, it stretched well into the afternoon. This was never framed as vanity. It was discipline. It was, in its own strange way, treated almost as a spiritual exercise, with each stage performed in careful sequence, using the correct tools before the correct mirror, ideally in front of an audience of friends who had come specifically to watch. Yes, watch. Grown men, some of them titled, some of them heirs to genuine fortunes, would sit in your rooms for an hour or more simply observing you get dressed, the way people today might watch someone plate an elaborate meal at a restaurant, admiring the technique as much as the result. Consider the math of it for a moment. If a man devotes the entire morning, and often a good portion of the afternoon, purely to constructing his appearance, there is very little time left over for anything resembling ordinary occupation. And that, of course, was precisely the point. To spend hours on your toilette was to announce, wordlessly but unmistakably, that you did not work, that you had never sullied your hands with anything so common as employment. Time itself became the true luxury item, and you spent it lavishly, extravagantly, on your own reflection. The ritual unfolded in careful stages. First came washing, then shaving, then the arrangement of the hair, then the great trial of the neckcloth, then finally the layered business of dressing proper, piece by exacting piece. Rush any single stage or perform it out of order and the whole structure could collapse. This was less like getting dressed and more like assembling an intricate mechanism that happened to be shaped like a gentleman. Your friends, sprawled comfortably about the room during all this, were not merely passing the time. They were students, in a sense, watching a master class performed live. How exactly does he manage that fold? Why does his coat sit that way across the shoulders when mine always bunches? Being permitted into a great man's dressing room to witness the process firsthand was genuinely something of an honor, a glimpse behind the curtain, and you could be certain that everything observed there would be discussed and dissected across half the clubs of London by nightfall. Now compare all this to your own hurried, ordinary mornings, hopping on one foot while pulling on a sock, half listening for a kettle. A dandy would find the entire scene horrifying. Speed was, in this world, something close to a moral failing. Efficiency belonged to tradesmen and clerks, not to gentlemen of leisure. The glory of the whole affair lay precisely in its unhurried pace, in the calm insistence that the world could simply wait until you were finished. And remarkably, the world usually did wait. By the time the toilette was complete, you had done far more than get dressed. You had constructed a version of yourself, polished and deliberate, so thoroughly composed that the hungover, sweat-damp, financially compromised man who had first opened his eyes that morning had been almost entirely papered over. In his place stood something closer to a monument, ready to be admired by anyone who happened to be looking, which, as it turned out, was rather the whole point. And naturally, all of this labor was aimed at a single, maddening goal, appearing as though none of it had happened at all. Hours spent constructing the illusion of a man who had simply thrown on the nearest clothes and walked out the door. We start unpicking that particular contradiction now, with something as basic as water. Let's talk first about something you probably take entirely for granted, and that most of fashionable London in 1814 regarded with genuine suspicion. You are about to wash your entire body with water, on purpose, and quite possibly every single day. This was not universal behavior. Far from it. In an age when a thorough scrubbing was still widely considered faintly risky to one's health, and when heavy perfume existed largely to disguise the absence of regular bathing, the dandy did something that struck many of his contemporaries as almost radical. He got properly, thoroughly clean, and then he insisted on smelling of essentially nothing at all. No heavy cologne, no musk, nothing but soap, fresh air, and the quiet confidence of a man whose pores were, for once, doing their job unimpeded. To understand how unusual this was, you need to picture what everyone else around you actually smelled like. This was a society where thick, cloying scents were applied specifically to mask the accumulated results of infrequent bathing, where a nobleman might carry the residue of several unwashed weeks beneath a fog of rosewater and musk. The fashionable nose had simply grown accustomed to a certain heaviness in the air. Into this walked the dandy, carrying nothing but the faint, clean scent of soap, and the effect landed like walking into a costume party as the only person not wearing a mask. None of this was easy to achieve. There was no convenient tap to turn. Water had to be hauled by hand, heated over a fire and poured into a tub, usually by servants who did not share their master's newfound enthusiasm for the ritual. Getting properly clean was labor, performed almost entirely by other people, which, naturally, only added to the prestige of the whole business. Anyone could splash water on their face. It took a full household staff and something close to a personal philosophy to bathe an entire body daily. Once in the tub, you scrubbed hard, until the skin went pink, slewing away every trace of the previous night's excess. The goal was never simply to be clean. It was to be conspicuously, unmistakably clean, in a way that others would notice, quietly envy, and rarely manage to replicate themselves. Your freshness became a kind of silent boast, a way of suggesting that everyone else in the room, whatever their rank or fortune, was, in fact, just a touch grubby by comparison. Here's a modern way to think about it. Today, when practically everyone showers daily, the real flex has moved elsewhere into elaborate skincare routines and expensive serums. But in 1814, the flex was almost embarrassingly simple. You outclassed a duke by being demonstrably, aggressively clean while he, quite often, was not. It was the era's equivalent of quietly ordering water at a party where everyone else is visibly overdoing it, and somehow coming out ahead regardless. There was something almost religious in the seriousness with which this cleanliness was pursued. It was not an occasional indulgence but a daily obligation, held to with something close to monastic discipline. Skip a day, and you had not merely been lazy. You had, in the private moral economy of the dandy, failed. The body was the foundation on which the entire glorious structure of dress would eventually be built, and no quality of tailoring could rescue a foundation that had been neglected. And so you emerge from the tub, pink-skinned, thoroughly scrubbed, and smelling triumphantly of almost nothing, the cleanest man in London and quietly pleased about it. There's a gentle irony worth sitting with here, that a movement remembered mostly for excess and eventual ruin began, every single morning with something as sensible and humble as a good wash. But the campaign against grime had only just begun. Your face, in particular, had opinions of its own, and it was time to deal with them directly. With the body conquered, we move to the face, and here the standards climb rather sharply. A dandy's face was expected to be smooth. Not reasonably smooth. Not smooth enough to pass in dim lighting. We're talking mirror fogging, newborn cheek smooth. Which means you now pick up a straight razor, a single unguarded blade of honed steel with no safety mechanism whatsoever, and drag it across your own throat before breakfast, while nursing a headache that would make a lesser man weep. Sit with the horror of that tool for a moment. Your razor is nothing more than a folding strip of steel, kept vicious on a leather strop, sharp enough to open a vein should your hand so much as tremble. No cartridge, no lubricating strip, no comforting little cushion of aloe. Just you, a blade honed to a whisper, a basin of cold water, and whatever remains of your composure after last night. Men were nicked regularly. Men were occasionally sliced rather badly, left dabbing at their own throats with a cloth and trying to look unbothered about it. A poor shave could leave a visible mark for days, which for a man whose entire identity rested on his appearance was a genuine catastrophe. You lather carefully, tilt your chin toward whatever light is available, and begin the slow, deliberate business of it. This was not a task performed in a hurry. Every stroke had to follow the grain, chasing smoothness into every hollow of the jaw, every stubborn angle. It demanded a completely steady hand and a perfectly clear head, both of which were in desperately short supply this particular morning, and yet the shave proceeded anyway, with the grim focus of a man diffusing something delicate, because an imperfect face simply was not an option. Then, because a mere shave was for ordinary men, came the tweezers. Any stray hair bold enough to have survived the razor was hunted down individually and yanked out by the root, with the patience of a saint and the pettiness of a tyrant. Try to imagine grooming so meticulous that you personally track down single rebellious hairs and execute them one by one. In any other context, this would suggest a man with entirely too much free time, which, of course, was precisely the impression being cultivated. There was a whole philosophy buried in this obsessive attention. The dandy believed, quite sincerely, that true refinement lived in the smallest details, the stray hair, the crooked fold, the faint smudge on an otherwise pristine glove, and that only a genuinely superior man bothered to notice and correct them all. There was no numbing agent, no soothing balm worth the name. Just cold water, a bracing splash, and the stoic understanding that beauty in this world required a measure of quiet suffering delivered entirely by your own hand. At last the face is finished, scraped, plucked, and buffed to something resembling a smooth river stone. You look once again entirely effortless, which by this point in the morning you understand to be the greatest lie of the entire enterprise. But the true trial still lies ahead, coiled on the dressing table like a patient adversary, waiting to test you in ways the razor never could. It is time, finally, to face the neckcloth. And now we arrive at the true test of the morning, the summit toward which everything else has merely been a preparation. The neckcloth, a long strip of starched white muslin, sometimes fine linen, wound carefully around the throat and tied into a knot precise enough that it might as well have carried its own diplomatic credentials. These knots had names, real, documented, satirized in the press names. There were styles built around mathematical precision, styles borrowed from the exotic and the oriental, styles named for conquering generals. Tying even one of them correctly was a delicate negotiation between starch, patience, and raw nerve, because the cloth offered exactly one attempt at perfection before it was ruined beyond saving. Understand what you were actually working with here. The neckcloth was starched rigid, sometimes stiff enough that turning your head became a genuine physical negotiation, which was, in a strange way, rather the point. That stiffness forced the chin upward and the posture straight, producing the particular lofty, faintly disdainful bearing that became the dandy's signature. The starch was both your ally and your enemy. It held whatever shape you managed to sculpt into it, but it was also entirely unforgiving. Fold it incorrectly, and there was no smoothing the mistake away. Crease it at the wrong angle, and the starch remembered that failure permanently. There was no second chance hiding inside a single piece of cloth. The tying itself became a small performance of held breath and careful fingers. You draped the strip around your neck and began, working almost entirely by feel and by whatever your mirror could show you, the slow architecture of the knot. Some men lowered their chin by degrees, pressing the folds into shape using the pressure of their own jaw. a technique that sounds like an invention and was, in fact, thoroughly real and widely practiced. One careless movement, one badly timed exhale, and the entire structure collapsed into a crumpled mess fit only for the discard pile. Ah yes, the discard pile. This detail, more than almost any other, captures the sheer madness of the whole undertaking. Legend has it that a visitor once called on the most celebrated arbiter of taste in all of London and found the floor of his dressing room scattered with what looked like a light snowfall of crumpled white cloth. Baffled, the visitor asked the valet what exactly he was looking at. The valet, with the gravity of a man announcing a state funeral, is said to have replied simply that these, sir, were their failures. Their failures. An entire small mountain of ruined linen, each discarded piece representing one attempt at a knot that had not quite reached perfection. It is, in essence, the 18th century version of taking 50 photographs to post a single one, except in this case, the 49 rejected attempts were piling visibly on the floor while an audience watched the process unfold in real time. Consider the pressure baked into this single garment. The neckcloth sat directly beneath the face, framing it, the very first thing any eye would land on upon entering a room. A magnificent coat could not rescue a badly tied neckcloth. It was the centerpiece, the keystone of the entire outfit, the one element that instantly separated a genuine man of fashion from a hopeful pretender playing dress-up. Everything in the end came down to those folds, and so men practiced obsessively. They studied one another's knots. They copied the arrangements of their betters, and, when talent allowed, invented entirely new ones to be copied in turn. A gentleman who managed to introduce a genuinely novel, elegant knot to fashionable society might see it spread across the city within days, immortalized in the mocking little satirical pamphlets that catalogued every fashionable neckcloth style with theatrical seriousness. To have a knot associated permanently with your name was a strange kind of immortality, achieved through nothing more than the artful strangling of your own throat. By the time your neckcloth finally sits correctly, crisp, sculptural, blindingly white, you have spent a genuinely alarming stretch of your morning locked in single combat with a piece of fabric, and emerged, this time, victorious. You touch it once, gently, testing its structure, and silently vow not to move your neck too suddenly for the rest of the day, a vow you will inevitably break by early afternoon. Speaking of that blinding white, we need to talk properly about just how demanding that particular shade actually was, and what it cost to maintain. Let's turn to the shirt, or more accurately, the shirts plural, because a single garment could never survive the demands placed upon it. To the dandy, the whiteness of one's linen was never a minor detail. It functioned almost as a moral position. Your shirt, your neckcloth, your collar all had to achieve a white so pure, so aggressively spotless, that the fabric appeared never to have made contact with actual human skin. Not cream, not ivory, certainly not the dull grayish tone that comes from linen that has met a real laundry more than once. We are talking about fresh snow, the wing of some improbable white bird, linen so bright it seemed almost to generate its own light. Now consider the city you actually lived in. London in this era was a place of thousands of coal fires burning simultaneously, of smoke thick enough to hang visibly in the streets, of soot drifting down constantly like some grim, unwelcome confetti settling over everything it touched. The very air of the city functioned as a quiet conspiracy against clean linen. Step outside for even an hour, and the atmosphere would patiently, persistently work to smudge you into the same general grayness as everyone around you. Keeping your whites genuinely white in such a place was not something achieved through occasional laundering. It was closer to open, continuous warfare against the air itself. And winning that war required an army. Behind your dazzling shirt front stood laundresses laboring for hours over tubs of scalding water, wielding soap, lye, and enormous quantities of starch, scrubbing and boiling and pressing until the fabric finally, grudgingly surrendered into something like perfection. This was brutal, red-knuckled labor, entirely invisible to the drawing rooms you would later stroll into, looking as though whiteness was simply your natural, effortless state. The elegance you wore so casually rested quite literally on someone else's aching hands, a fact you were careful never to dwell on for very long. And because London's grime never took a day off, neither could you. A truly proper gentleman might change his linen more than once within a single day, discarding a shirt the moment it committed the crime of looking merely slightly less than immaculate, replacing it immediately with something fresh. Sweat, soot, the ordinary insults of an ordinary day. All of it accumulated relentlessly, and all of it had to be banished on sight. A growing pile of discarded shirts, rather than suggesting carelessness, became instead a strange badge of honor. The more linen you soiled, the more you must be changing, and the more you changed, the grander and more fastidious you were understood to be. Here is the delicious absurdity buried at the heart of it. In this particular world, a mountain of dirty laundry was, in its own way, proof of cleanliness. A towering pile of shirts awaiting the wash did not signal a slob. It signaled a man so committed to freshness that he burned through pristine garments at a rate ordinary men could never hope to sustain. It was consumption turned into display, waste turned into a quiet form of wealth, the same underlying impulse that today drives people to flaunt exactly how much of something expensive they can afford to use up without a second thought. The financial cost of all this was, predictably, ruinous. Fine linen did not come cheap. An army of laundresses did not labor for free, and multiple changes of shirt each day meant owning dozens of them, each one representing a real investment, the accumulated bills for their care alone capable of quietly staggering even a comfortable fortune. But a dandy did not concern himself with such vulgar arithmetic, at least not out loud, not until the creditors eventually came calling, which, in time, they most certainly would. For now, though, you button yourself into linen of genuinely impossible whiteness, feeling it crisp and cool against skin still faintly damp from the morning's scrubbing, radiating a purity that quietly insults everyone else in the room without you having to say a single word. The foundation is laid, the face is smooth, the throat is sculpted, the linen glows. Now comes the part of the morning where comfort is formally, permanently retired because it is finally time to get dressed in earnest. Now, at long last, it is time to put on your actual clothes, and I use the phrase put on rather generously, because a dandy did not so much wear his garments as get carefully, methodically poured into them. The entire governing philosophy here was fit, and then more fit, and then, once you thought you had achieved enough fit, still more fit beyond that. Where the flamboyant, fashionable men of an earlier generation had drowned themselves in embroidery, jewels, and enough lace to furnish a cathedral, the dandy moved decisively in the opposite direction. His authority came not from decoration but from tailoring so exact, so sculpted precisely to the body, that the clothing appeared to have simply grown there naturally, without human intervention at all. Begin with the coat, and understand immediately that it was engineered rather than merely sewn. A master tailor cut it to trace the exact lines of your shoulders, your chest, the particular curve of your back, sometimes incorporating careful padding to quietly correct whatever nature had neglected to provide, broadening a narrow shoulder here, smoothing an awkward angle there. The finished result was designed to resemble the body of some idealized man, and if your actual physical form fell short of that ideal, well, that discrepancy is precisely what the padding and the cut existed to disguise. You were, in every meaningful sense, in partnership with your tailor, and your tailor was doing the overwhelming majority of the heavy lifting. The fit was cut so close that movement itself became a genuine complication. A coat tailored this snugly did not comfortably permit anything so undignified as reaching overhead, stretching, or lifting the arms much above shoulder height. Sitting had to be managed with real care. Bending forward required something close to negotiation. Certain coats were tailored so tightly across the back that a gentleman required actual physical assistance simply getting into them, his valet easing one arm in at a time with the careful precision of a squire fitting a knight for armor, which, in terms of restricted mobility, was really not too far removed from the truth. Breeches and the rest of the leg wear were held to an equally merciless standard. They had to cling smoothly, without a single visible wrinkle, without any sag, without the faintest betraying bulge at the knee. A wrinkle in the wrong place was never treated as a minor cosmetic flaw. It was read as evidence of failure, a visible crack running straight through the illusion of the perfectly composed man. Everything was pulled taut, tucked, smoothed relentlessly, until you resembled less a person who had simply gotten dressed and more a carefully upholstered figure assembled for display. The layers built up in a precise, unchangeable sequence. Shirt, then waistcoat, then coat, each stage adding its own contribution to the overall sculpted silhouette, each one demanding its own careful adjustment before proceeding. The waistcoat had to reveal exactly the correct amount of itself beneath the coat, no more, no less. The coat itself had to close, or in certain fashionable configurations, deliberately not close, in exactly the manner current taste dictated. There existed one correct way to manage all of this and roughly 1,000 incorrect ways, and the difference between them was entirely invisible to an untrained eye while remaining blindingly, embarrassingly obvious to anyone whose opinion actually mattered. The clearest modern comparison is a beautifully tailored suit pushed to a genuinely deranged extreme. We admire a well-fitted jacket today, certainly, but we still expect, reasonably, to breathe normally, sit comfortably, and lift a fork to our mouth without incident. The dandy accepted no such compromises whatsoever. Comfort was simply not on offer as an option. If looking magnificent required moving through the world like a marionette with slightly tangled strings, sitting bolt upright through an entire evening's entertainment, then that was a price cheerfully paid, or at minimum paid, with an expression that betrayed absolutely nothing of the discomfort underneath. And here lies the whole quiet sleight of hand at the center of the dandy's entire craft. All of this engineering, all of this padding and tugging and near-immobilizing tightness existed for one purpose only, to produce the impression of complete, natural, unstudied ease. As though you had simply been born looking precisely this good, and your clothing had thoughtfully arranged itself around your natural perfection without any effort on your part whatsoever. Effortless once again, purchased at the cost of staggering, deliberate effort. Fully dressed now, you stand rigid and resplendent, essentially unable to bend properly at the waist, and entirely, serenely at peace with that particular limitation. But before we properly admire the finished silhouette, there is a small structural secret laced tightly beneath it all that the fashionable portraits of the era conveniently never show you. Here is a detail the paintings tend to leave out entirely. Underneath all that crisp, sculpted perfection, a great many fashionable gentlemen were, in fact, laced into corsets. Stays reinforced with genuine whalebone, the same body-shaping devices we typically associate exclusively with women's fashion of the period, were also quietly cinching the waistlines of vain men across London, up to and including the Prince Regent himself, a man famously fond of a narrow, fashionable silhouette despite possessing an increasingly unfashionable appetite for rich food. The underlying logic, such as it was, held together reasonably well. The dandy's entire visual effect depended on a coat that fit like a coat of paint sitting above a waist that tapered elegantly beneath a broad chest. But bodies, being stubbornly themselves, do not always cooperate obediently with the demands of fashion. Good living, rich meals, endless bottles of wine, and long nights spent at the card table all have a well-documented habit of settling comfortably around the midsection. And when a man's waistline began expanding while the prevailing silhouette demanded precisely the opposite, there really was only one remaining solution, and it involved a considerable quantity of whalebone and a servant strong enough and willing enough to pull the laces tight. So into the stays you went. These were stiff garments reinforced with strips of whalebone, that flexible yet resilient material harvested from the mouths of whales, used here to impose rigid structure onto the stubborn softness of an ordinary human torso. Laced up the back, they compressed the waist, flattened the stomach, and forced the whole torso into the fashionably narrow line the coat above it demanded. Getting into them was never a solo undertaking. A gentleman would grip something solid and stationary while a servant hauled steadily on the laces from behind, the two of them working together like sailors straining at a capstan, gradually bringing an unruly waistline under strict and uncomfortable control. The results, it must be said, were genuinely effective, but the costs were entirely real as well. A man laced too aggressively tightly could barely eat a proper meal, could not draw a truly deep breath, and in a warm, crowded ballroom might find the entire world beginning to swim gently at the edges of his vision before crumpling, as gracefully as circumstances allowed, straight to the floor. The fashionable fainting spell was a genuine, recurring hazard of the season, and while it was always politely attributed afterward to the heat, or the stuffiness of the room, or the general crush of the crowd, everyone with a shred of sense understood perfectly well that the real culprit was a vice of tightly laced whalebone squeezing the air steadily out of some poor gentleman's lungs. The satirists of the age, naturally, could hardly believe their good fortune. Caricaturists sketched dandies being cheerfully winched into their corsets by straining, red-faced servants, faces gone purple with effort, stomachs bulging comically above and below the laces like dough escaping a container several sizes too small. The image of a vain man crushed quite literally into shape by his own vanity was simply too rich a target to resist, and the prince sold briskly, gleefully mocking the very men who set the fashions everyone else was scrambling desperately to imitate. There is something rather touchingly human buried in all of this. We tend to picture these gentlemen as effortlessly slender figures gliding weightlessly through crowded ballrooms, when in truth, a good number of them were perfectly ordinary men, fighting exactly the same losing battle against their own waistlines that people fight today, only with considerably fewer options available to them, and a great deal more whalebone involved in the process. The narrow, sculpted figure so admired from across a crowded drawing room was, quite frequently, an elaborate construction, an illusion held together entirely by lacing, sheer willpower, and the quiet, ongoing suffering of a man who could not comfortably manage to bend forward even to pick something up off the floor. So as you stand there now, ribs gently protesting their confinement, breath shallow, formally forbidden from anything so reckless as a truly full inhale, take some small comfort in the knowledge that you keep exalted company in your suffering, reaching all the way up to the future king himself. The price of the perfect line was measured, in the end, in comfort, in dignity, and on certain unlucky occasions in outright consciousness. And speaking of that line, we still haven't settled the great, ongoing debate troubling the fashionable leg of 1814. What, precisely, does a man of taste actually wear below the waist this season? Let's move down now to the legs, where a genuine quiet revolution had been underway for some years already. For generations before this, a well-bred gentleman wore knee breeches, buttoned snugly just below the knee, paired with fine stockings that displayed a shapely calf, because remarkably, a good calf had once functioned as a genuine selling point in the marriage market. But fashion, as it always does, was shifting beneath your very feet, quite literally in this case. Enter the pantaloon, a skin-tight leg garment stretched over the limb like a coat of paint, and the increasingly popular trouser, a longer garment draping all the way down to the ankle. Consider the old world first, because it explains precisely what these newer fashions were rebelling against. Breeches ended abruptly at the knee, leaving the entire lower leg on full display within a stocking, which meant a gentleman's calf became, in effect, public property, judged and admired openly the way any other physical feature might be. A man blessed with a fine, muscular calf could strut about with total confidence, while a man cursed with a thinner, less impressive one might quietly resort to padding to fill out the offending shape, because heaven forbid anyone glimpse an inadequate leg in a crowded ballroom. It is genuinely difficult, from our modern vantage point, to overstate how much serious attention was once devoted to the humble calf, a body part most people today have never once consciously considered in their entire lives, now the pantaloon. Think of these as the athleisure of their era, if athleisure required being essentially sewn directly into the garment. Cut to cling with almost indecent closeness to the leg, they traced every line running from hip to ankle without concealing a single detail, and achieving that skin-tight effect required real effort. They might be constructed from a stretchy knitted fabric or cut cleverly on the bias to hug the natural form of the leg. Legend insists that the truly committed devotees would dampen the fabric and pull the garment on while still wet, allowing it to dry and shrink directly onto the leg like a very fashionable, very uncomfortable second skin. The image of a grown man wrestling himself into damp trousers purely, so they would contract onto his body, remains one of the era's more overlooked comic set pieces. Then came the trouser proper, longer and considerably looser than the pantaloon, falling all the way down to the ankle and pointing quietly, unmistakably toward the future of men's fashion. Trousers represented the new thing, the daring thing, the choice of the genuinely forward-looking man, and they carried with them a faint whiff of rebellion precisely because they broke so cleanly with the established order of knee breeches. To wear trousers was to signal, without saying a word, that you moved with the times, that you occupied the leading edge of taste rather than clinging stubbornly to your grandfather's styles. But, and this distinction mattered enormously, the old order did not surrender its ground quietly or completely. Within the most rigid strongholds of high society, knee breeches remain not merely preferred but strictly, non-negotiably mandatory, a rule enforced with a seriousness that bordered on genuine absurdity. Certain hallowed assembly rooms would not admit a man wearing trousers under any circumstances whatsoever, regardless of his rank, his fame, or the impeccable quality of everything else about his appearance. Arrive in the wrong leg wear, and you would be turned away at the very door like a complete stranger, a humiliation we will examine in full detail once we reach those famously merciless assembly rooms later in our story. So your choice of what to wear below the waist was never a trivial decision made carelessly. It functioned as a small daily declaration of allegiance. Breeches spoke of tradition, formality, respect for the way things had always properly been done. Pantaloons and trousers spoke of modernity, boldness, a willingness to lead fashion rather than simply follow behind it. And a genuinely canny dandy learned to read the room correctly, understanding exactly which battlefield he was walking onto that particular evening, and dressing his legs accordingly, because the wrong decision could quite literally bar the door against him or brand him permanently as a relic of an earlier, less interesting age. You settle finally on your leg wear for the day, ease into it with the appropriate degree of careful struggle, and admire the clean, unbroken line running the full length downward. You are nearly complete now, but a gentleman's outfit, however flawless above the waist, could still be entirely undone by what he chose to place upon his feet, and dandy footwear demanded a shine bordering on the genuinely supernatural. No respectable dandy outfit was ever considered complete without proper footwear, and here the standards reached a level of shine so intense it practically constituted a personality trait all its own. Tall, gleaming Hessian boots, complete with their small decorative tassels, or sleek top boots favored by the country set, all buffed relentlessly to a mirror finish so flawless you could genuinely check the state of your neckcloth in the reflected surface. Achieving a shine of that caliber was considered something close to a dark art, jealously guarded by valets across the city, and legend insists that the most exacting, most fashionable gentlemen of the age demanded their boot polish be mixed with actual champagne, because ordinary blacking was, quite simply, not extravagant enough for footwear that had cost more than a working laborer might earn across an entire year. Start with the boots themselves, because these were genuinely serious pieces of craftsmanship in their own right. Hessian boots rose to just below the knee, cut into a graceful curving line at the front, and finished with a small, jaunty tassel dangling from the top edge, a style borrowed directly from military fashion, and enthusiastically adopted by gentlemen who had never come within 100 miles of an actual battlefield in their lives. Top boots, favored particularly for riding and other country pursuits, featured a contrasting band of paler leather wrapped around the upper edge, a look that suggested sporting country gentlemen even when worn by a man who could barely manage to stay mounted on a horse for more than a few minutes at a time. Both styles were crafted from the very finest leather, fitted closely to the shape of the leg, and priced in a manner calculated to make your eyes water on delivery. But owning the boots themselves represented only the very beginning of the obsession. The true fixation lay entirely in the shine. A dandy's boots had to gleam like polished glass, catching and reflecting the world around them with every single step. Utterly free of any scuff or dullness or the ordinary, where that comes from actually walking on real city streets. This was never a shine achievable with a quick, careless buff against the back of a trouser leg. This demanded genuine labor, real expertise, and closely guarded secret recipes, the precise composition of a truly excellent blacking treated by valets rather like a closely held family secret passed down through careful instruction. And this is precisely where the champagne enters the legend properly. The story, retold with obvious relish for generations since, holds that the most exacting dandies of the age insisted their boot polish be blended with genuine champagne, because plain ordinary blacking was simply beneath the dignity of footwear this expensive. Whether the addition of champagne actually improved the resulting shine in any measurable way, or whether the whole practice amounted to pure, glorious, wasteful extravagance for its own sake, is almost entirely beside the point. What matters is that men were genuinely said to be pouring good, drinkable wine directly into their shoe polish, an act so magnificently wasteful that it perfectly captures the entire absurd spirit animating the whole enterprise. Somewhere across town, a bootmaker was going unpaid while his own customer casually marinated a pair of boots in vintage champagne. Picture the strange arithmetic sitting underneath all of this. Here is a man who quite possibly owes his tailor a genuinely alarming sum of money, who actively dodges certain creditors down particular side streets to avoid an awkward encounter, whose entire fashionable existence teeters precariously on a mountain of accumulated credit, and yet he will insist, absolutely and without any apparent irony, that his boot polish must contain champagne. The finances of the dandy make no rational sense whatsoever until you fully accept the central governing principle of his entire worldview. Appearances were everything, and money, right up until the terrible morning when money suddenly turned out to be everything after all, was treated as though it barely existed at all. The careful maintenance never stopped at the initial polishing either. Boots had to be constantly tended, protected, treated with something approaching genuine reverence as though they were sacred objects rather than mere footwear. A dedicated valet might spend a considerable portion of each day tending exclusively to his master's boots, coaxing out every last bit of shine, guarding constantly against the mud and general filth of the city streets that lay in wait for every single step taken outdoors. To scuff a boot, even slightly, was treated as a small personal tragedy. To be seen anywhere in public wearing dull, neglected leather was to confess openly to the entire world that you had, in some fundamental sense, simply given up on yourself. And so you slide your freshly washed feet into boots that shine like dark mirrors, faintly, almost absurdly, possibly still carrying the ghost of champagne somewhere in their gleam. And the transformation from the hungover figure who woke that morning is now, finally, essentially complete. But before you can properly dazzle the streets of London, there remains still the small but crucial matter of the coat itself, and choosing its precise color correctly turns out to be its own quiet act of considerable genius. Now for the true crown jewel sitting atop the entire ensemble, the coat. And this is precisely where the dandy's real genius reveals itself most clearly. You might reasonably expect a man this deeply obsessed with appearance to drape himself in shimmering gold thread and vivid jewel tones. You would, in fact, be entirely wrong. The dandy's true masterstroke was restraint itself. Deep, sober colors, midnight blue, bottle green, and above all, unrelenting black. No sparkle whatsoever, no flash, no clownish rainbow of competing colors. Just impeccably cut cloth worked by a master tailor in tones, so understated they practically dared an observer to look closer and discover the quality hiding underneath. To fully grasp how genuinely radical this choice actually was, you have to remember clearly what had come immediately before it. The previous generation of fashionable men had dressed themselves rather like walking chandeliers, draped head to toe in shimmering silks, embroidered thoroughly from collar down to hem, powdered, patched with small decorative marks, and glittering with enough accumulated decoration to comfortably outshine the altar of a fashionable church. They believed, quite sincerely and without much question, that true magnificence simply meant more. More color, more embroidery, more of absolutely everything all at once. A gentleman announced his personal importance by covering himself visibly in expensive, undeniable proof of it. In much the same way a peacock settles the entire argument the moment it unfolds its tail. The dandy looked carefully at all that shimmering, competitive excess and quietly, deliberately decided the whole approach was fundamentally vulgar. His rebellion was not to add more but to subtract almost everything. He stripped the color out entirely, banished the embroidery altogether, and stood there instead in plain, unadorned dark wool. And in doing precisely that, he managed to make every gaudily dressed man in the room look, by comparison, as though he was trying far too hard for far too little effect. It was a genuinely devastating strategic move, because it simply could not be countered by spending more money in response. You cannot meaningfully outsparkle a man who has already decided, with total conviction, that sparkle itself is fundamentally beneath him. The message quietly buried inside that dark, sober cloth carried its own kind of elegant savagery. It said, in effect, that any fool possessing a sufficiently full purse could purchase bright silk and drape himself in gold thread without any particular skill or judgment required. It takes a genuinely superior sensibility to command an entire room while wearing nothing more than flawless plain wool that simply happens to fit like an absolute dream. The center of power had shifted decisively from the fabric itself to the man wearing it, from mere decoration to precision of cut, and only those observers who genuinely possessed real taste could reliably tell the difference between an ordinary black coat and a truly perfect one. That distinction, naturally, was the entire point of the exercise. Two coats might both technically be black, both cut from plain cloth, and yet one would hang from the shoulders like a kind of divine judgment while the other merely, adequately covered a torso. The real quality lived entirely in the weave of the wool, the precision of the cut, the exact set of the shoulders, the particular fall of the coat's skirts, 1,000 tiny perfections that only a genuine connoisseur could properly name individually, but that virtually everyone in the room could somehow feel instinctively, even without the vocabulary to explain why. You were forcing an entire room to look more closely, to notice genuine quality rather than mere quantity, and that fundamental shift in perception became the dandy's most lasting and least acknowledged revolution. Here is the modern echo of all this, and you likely already understand it in your bones without needing it explained. It's the reason a plain, beautifully cut piece of clothing in a quiet, understated color can still comfortably outclass something louder, flashier, and considerably more expensive. It's the whole underlying idea that real elegance tends to whisper while cheap taste generally shouts, that the most genuinely confident presence in any room is very often the simplest one present. That particular instinct did not always exist as common wisdom. It was invented, more or less deliberately, by these specific men in these specific coats, born out of sheer competitive contempt for the peacocks who had confidently strutted before them. So you shrug carefully into your dark, perfectly cut coat, feeling it settle onto your shoulders as though it had somehow grown there naturally, and you understand, finally, that you are not underdressed in the slightest. You are, in fact, the most dangerous kind of dress there is, the kind that quietly makes everyone else in the room suddenly doubt the wisdom of their own reflection. Now, at last, the head itself requires proper attention. And even your hair, it turns out, was carefully engineered to look as though you had never once thought about it at all. Let's deal now with the hair, which, like literally everything else about your carefully constructed appearance, amounts to a meticulously engineered illusion of total indifference. Just a few short decades earlier, a fashionable head would have been buried entirely beneath a towering mountain of powdered wig, dusted white with starch, until it resembled nothing so much as a snowdrift that had somehow developed strong personal opinions. But those particular days were dying out rapidly, hastened along considerably by a government tax levied specifically on hair powder, which made frosted, powdered heads suddenly far less appealing once the wallet got properly involved in the decision. So the dandy went natural. Sort of. The powdered wig, at the true height of its popularity, had represented a genuine monument to pure artifice. Towering, heavily powdered, sometimes greased, and built up over elaborate internal frames into shapes that defied both gravity and ordinary common sense simultaneously. It served as the ultimate statement that a true gentleman need not resemble anything so mundane as an ordinary human being. Powder rained down constantly from these elaborate constructions in a steady fine drizzle, coating shoulders and furniture alike, and properly maintaining even one wig was a genuinely filthy, expensive, faintly absurd undertaking. And then, naturally, a clever government, always alert to fresh opportunities for separating the wealthy from their money, slapped a tax directly onto the very powder that made the entire fashion possible, and the trend began dying almost overnight as a direct result. Into this sudden vacuum stepped the dandy, and his solution was, on its surface, simplicity itself. Real hair, entirely your own, cut and carefully arranged into styles carrying romantic names borrowed directly from the marble busts of ancient Rome, tousled and swept artfully forward into a kind of studied disarray, meant to evoke a certain noble simplicity, as though you were somehow less a devoted man of fashion and more a wandering philosopher who simply happened, almost by accident, to look genuinely incredible. The powder was gone entirely. The wig itself was gone. In their place stood a head of natural hair, appearing casually perfect, except, of course, it was not remotely casual in reality. That windswept, seemingly accidental tumble of curls was the direct product of considerable sustained labor, coaxed carefully into shape using combs, damp fingers, and a genuinely significant amount of time spent standing before a mirror quietly muttering instructions to yourself. The entire effect was carefully designed to look purely accidental, as though you had simply run a careless hand through your own hair while thinking about something considerably more important and happened, by pure chance, to land squarely on perfection. In actual reality, it was every bit as choreographed as everything else about your appearance, another polished performance of effortlessness that had, in truth, cost real and considerable effort to achieve. Then there was the separate matter of hair oil, applied liberally to give the hair its fashionable shine and to help tame it properly into obedient submission. Gentlemen applied these scented oils with genuine enthusiasm, so much enthusiasm, in fact, that an entirely new domestic problem was quietly born as a direct result. Men would lean their well-oiled heads back comfortably against the fine upholstered chairs found in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across the city, and the grease would gradually soak directly into the fabric, leaving a permanent dark smudge exactly where a fashionable head had habitually rested. The practical solution that emerged was a small protective cloth draped carefully over the back of every good upholstered chair, a modest square of fabric whose sole reason for existing was absorbing the accumulated drippings of vain men. Pause for a moment on that particular detail. An entire category of household linen came into common existence purely to defend expensive furniture from the hair products favored by fashionable gentlemen. It is precisely the sort of small, faintly ridiculous detail that somehow tells you more about an entire era than any grand historical narrative ever could. The quiet, ongoing testimony of 1,000 greasy chair backs scattered across fashionable London drawing rooms. So you finish arranging your hair, artfully disheveled and gleaming faintly with scented oil, appearing as though you simply rolled directly out of bed looking like some natural wonder, when in truth you have been carefully working at it for a considerable stretch of the morning. The illusion is very nearly complete now, running from the crown of your head all the way down to the tip of your boot. All that remains are the small final flourishes, the little props and accessories that transform a merely well-dressed man into a fully armed and fully operational one. Before you can properly face the world outside, we need to attend to the accessories, those small props that finish transforming a merely well-dressed man into a fully armed, fully operational performer. First, gloves, spotless and fitted snugly, and a truly serious gentleman of fashion might change them several times over the course of a single day. Then a walking cane, carried not because you needed any actual help walking, but because a cane gave your idle hands something graceful to occupy them with, something to twirl, to lean upon, to point meaningfully at whatever displeased you. And finally, the true weapon of the fashionable snob, the quizzing glass. Begin with the gloves because they represented their own perfect little tyranny. Made from fine, pale leather, fitted so closely to the hand that pulling them on became its own small daily ceremony. They had to remain absolutely immaculate at every moment. A glove that had picked up even a faint smudge, a small stain, any mark whatsoever from the grubby outside world constituted a genuine emergency, and the solution was simply to change into a fresh pair immediately. A gentleman might reasonably work through several pairs of gloves before a single evening concluded, each swap representing another small expense, another quiet proof that he lived at a standard of freshness ordinary men simply could not hope to sustain. Your hands, much like your linen, functioned as a constant battlefield in the unending war against London's ever-present grime. Then came the cane, that most gloriously unnecessary of objects. You did not need it for walking. You were, after all, a young man in the very prime of life, not some tottering elder requiring support. The cane existed for entirely different reasons altogether. It gave your hands a purpose, something elegant to hold, to twirl idly between the fingers, to plant firmly before you as you paused mid-stroll to survey the passing crowd. It could be leaned upon with a studied, practiced nonchalance. It could be raised to gesture meaningfully, or pointed with just the faintest hint of dismissal at something or someone you wished to visibly disregard. It functioned, in essence, as a kind of punctuation for the body, a prop that transformed ordinary standing about into a carefully choreographed series of elegant poses. And now, the true crown of the accessories, the quizzing glass. Picture a single lens mounted on a decorative handle, often hung from a ribbon around the neck for easy retrieval, and picture carefully the entire ritual surrounding its use. You would spot a person across the room, perhaps a rival, perhaps some hopeful social climber, and you would slowly, deliberately raise the glass to one eye. Then you would look, not a quick glance but a long, unhurried inspection, taking in every detail of their dress and bearing through that magnifying lens before finally lowering the glass again, your expression carrying an unmistakable, faint judgment. You had examined them the way a naturalist might examine some curious beetle pinned to a board, and found them, in the end, wanting. It amounted, in essence, to the ancient art of looking someone up and down, except formalized, weaponized, and equipped with an actual optical instrument specifically, so the target could not possibly mistake your meaning. To be quizzed openly by the wrong dandy in the wrong room amounted to a small, entirely public execution. There was no ambiguity whatsoever in the gesture. The slow raising of the glass, the unhurried, deliberate inspection, the cool lowering that followed, all of it announced with perfect clarity that you had looked closely and remained entirely unimpressed. These props, taken together as a complete set, transformed you from a man who was merely well-dressed into one who was fully operational. The gloves proved your fastidiousness. The cane gave your otherwise idle body a kind of purposeful elegance. The quizzing glass armed you properly for social combat. Each object functioned as a genuine tool, and a dandy without his tools was really only half himself, a beautifully dressed figure with nothing meaningful to do with his hands and no proper way to deliver a well-aimed social snub. At last you are fully complete. Scrubbed, sculpted, tailored, gleaming, gloved, and thoroughly armed for whatever the day might bring. There is truly nothing left to accomplish within these rented rooms. It is time, finally, to step out into the London daylight and perform the one act that all of this elaborate preparation was ever truly building toward. It is time, at long last, to be seen. You emerge, blinking slightly against the daylight, and now comes the entire real point of all that painstaking labor being properly looked at. The fashionable streets of London, Bond Street chief among them by a considerable margin, functioned as considerably less a place to actually purchase goods, and considerably more an open-air stage, where the city's beautiful people paraded slowly up and down for the sole genuine purpose of seeing and being seen in return. This ritual was known simply as the Promenade, and it operated according to unwritten rules considerably more intricate than any formal dance. Picture the scene properly. Certain fashionable streets, at certain fashionable hours, filled entirely with the fashionable set, every single one of them out walking on foot, everyone dressed to absolute perfection, everyone pretending quite convincingly that they were simply out taking the air while, in reality, conducting a fierce and entirely silent competition against everyone else present. The shops themselves stood open along the route, their window displays glittering invitingly, but actual shopping amounted to little more than a convenient pretext. The real business at hand was the parade itself, that slow-moving river of magnificently dressed people flowing steadily along the pavements, each individual serving as a moving exhibition of taste, wealth, and carefully studied indifference. The pace of it all mattered enormously, and that pace was, without exception, slow. To hurry along was to confess openly that you had somewhere else to be, some pressing obligation, some purpose beyond simple leisure, and nothing could possibly be more damning for a man whose entire personal brand rested on the premise that he neither worked nor ever rushed for anything. So you strolled, unhurried and entirely serene, drifting along at the exact measured pace of a man possessed of infinite time and absolutely nowhere in particular he needed to be. Your walk itself became a kind of public statement, and the statement being made was simply that you were at leisure, gloriously and visibly so, and that the watching world was, quite fortunately, witnessing it firsthand. Then there was the intricate, constantly shifting choreography of acknowledgement. As you drifted slowly along, you would inevitably encounter other people. And every single encounter demanded an instant, split-second judgment on your part. Whom exactly do you greet, and with precisely how much warmth? Whom do you favor with only a brief nod? Whom do you honor instead with a full, gracious bow? And whom, finally, do you sail straight past entirely, as though they were nothing more substantial than a lamppost standing in your path? These small decisions were watched closely by everyone nearby, noted carefully, and remembered for later discussion. A warm greeting, generously given, could genuinely lift a person's social standing. A cold, deliberate non-acknowledgement could just as easily puncture it. You were, with every single step you took, dispensing a form of social currency, and you learned quickly to spend it with real care. You also had the ongoing task of properly managing your own visual display, presenting yourself to the watching street from your most flattering angles, letting the available daylight catch the perfect fall of your coat and the blinding whiteness of your linen, all while wearing this carefully constructed public self as though you remained entirely, blissfully unaware of it. That particular trick, appearing flawlessly turned out while seeming utterly unconscious of the fact, represented perhaps the single greatest skill a dandy could ever hope to master, the appearance of never once having considered that anyone nearby might actually be looking. The looking itself was, naturally, the entire point of the exercise, but a proper dandy could never once seem to notice or acknowledge it openly. Some men grew so genuinely devoted to this particular ritual of decorative, purposeful loitering that they became known specifically for the habit, earning a particular reputation for spending entire afternoons draped elegantly along the fashionable streets, accomplishing precisely nothing of any real substance whatsoever. To lounge, to stroll, to be seen properly, to see others in turn, and to silently pass judgment on everyone who happened to walk by. This became a full and serious occupation, pursued with the kind of earnest dedication that would seem genuinely baffling if it were not, in its own way, so instantly recognizable even today. We've all witnessed some version of the modern equivalent, the carefully arranged public self, the casual stroll that is secretly, entirely a performance, the effortless look that quietly took a full hour to construct properly beforehand. Understand clearly what you were actually doing out there on those fashionable streets. You were not simply walking. You were presenting yourself formally to the city, offering it the considerable gift of your carefully constructed appearance, and expecting, quite reasonably in your own view, that the city respond with appropriate gratitude. And the fashionable world, for its own part, generally played along willingly, because everyone else strolling that same pavement happened to be doing precisely the same thing simultaneously, each person performing earnestly for an audience that was itself equally busy performing right back. But a stroll of this particular caliber could never happen without the specific men who actually made you look this good in the first place, the true hidden architects of the entire illusion. And they were, even now, beginning to wonder rather anxiously exactly when you might finally intend to pay them what you owed. Behind every truly legendary dandy stood a small dedicated army of tradesmen who actually made all this careful magic possible, and chief among them, by a considerable margin, stood the tailor. The great tailoring houses scattered throughout London functioned as the true wizards operating behind this entire elaborate world, men capable of cutting and stitching a coat so exquisitely well that a complete nobody could walk confidently into any room and comfortably outdress a genuine duke. Gentlemen remained fiercely, almost religiously loyal to their chosen tailor, treating him almost as a genuine creative collaborator in a shared, ongoing masterpiece, and would discuss the precise hang of a single sleeve with all the gravity of generals carefully planning a major military campaign. Let us give these particular craftsmen their proper due, because they were, by any reasonable measure, genuine artists in their own right. A truly master tailor understood the human body the way a skilled sculptor understands raw stone, seeing clearly not merely what already existed in front of him, but what could still be carefully coaxed out of it with sufficient skill. He knew precisely where to add padding, where to nip the fabric in, where to let the cloth fall naturally, and where instead to hold it firmly in place. He could take an entirely ordinary man of no particular natural shape, and through cut and craft alone, send him back out into the world looking convincingly like some idealized version of himself. This was never mere sewing. It amounted to genuine transformation, and the very best practitioners of the craft were sought after eagerly, celebrated widely, and courted persistently like the quietly powerful figures they had in fact become. The relationship between a dandy and his personal tailor tended to be oddly intimate in nature. You returned faithfully to the same man again and again over the years, and he gradually came to know your particular body, your habitual posture, your specific flaws, and precisely how best to disguise each one. Fittings were treated as genuinely serious occasions, conducted with murmured concentration, the tailor circling you slowly with pins and chalk in hand, while the two of you discussed the exact angle of a lapel or the precise fall of a coat's skirts, as though the fate of entire nations somehow hung in the balance. In a very real sense, the two of you functioned as partners engaged in a single, ongoing masterpiece, and that masterpiece was, quite simply, the carefully maintained public illusion of you. There was, however, one small but persistently recurring difficulty embedded within this otherwise beautiful partnership, and that difficulty was payment. The entire dandy economy operated not primarily on money actually changing hands, but rather on credit, on the polite, gentlemanly understanding that a fashionable customer's account would eventually be settled in full, at some conveniently vague and perpetually receding point somewhere off in the future. The gentleman himself never soiled the elegance of a fitting session by discussing anything so grubby as the actual bill. He simply ordered and wore, and ordered again, while the accumulated sums owed grew quietly and steadily in the tailor's private ledger like some slow, inexorable tide coming in. The tailor, for his own part, extended these genuinely enormous lines of credit with a curious mixture of professional pride and quiet, ongoing prayer. There was real prestige attached to dressing the leading dandies of the age. In having the most fashionable men in London seen regularly in your particular coats, and that accumulated prestige reliably drew in other, more financially reliable customers as a direct result. So the tailor gambled, essentially, clothing men of considerable dazzling reputation, and often rather dubious solvency, betting that the honor of the public association, or the eventual, hoped-for settling of the account, would ultimately make the considerable risk worthwhile. Sometimes it genuinely did. Often, unfortunately, it did not, and the craftsman was left holding a stack of beautifully made, entirely unpaid invoices for garments worn proudly to 100 parties he could never have personally afforded to attend himself. It is a strange, faintly melancholy picture once you examine it directly and honestly. The most magnificent men in all of London, widely admired and quietly envied and endlessly copied by lesser men, floated serenely through fashionable society, draped entirely in the uncompensated labor of tradesmen they were, in a very real sense, quietly ruining financially. The gleaming boots, the perfectly cut coats, the blindingly white linen, all of it ultimately built on the patience and unpaid toil of working people whose names history has largely failed to properly record. The dandy took all the glory for himself. The tailor absorbed all the risk, and risk, as it always eventually does, has a persistent habit of coming due, first for the long-suffering tradesman, and in time, inevitably, for the gentleman as well. But those particular grim reckonings still lay somewhere off in the future. For now, the accumulated debts remained just abstract numbers quietly recorded in a ledger, and there was a considerably more pressing appointment waiting to be kept. The club was calling, and the very best seat in the entire house was waiting there for you. Every self-respecting dandy required a proper headquarters, a private kingdom entirely his own where the ordinary vulgar public could simply never follow him. And that meant, invariably, the gentleman's club. These were exclusive private institutions where fashionable men gathered regularly to eat, to drink, to gamble, to gossip freely, and to steadily refine the delicate, demanding craft of looking down comfortably on absolutely everyone else. At the most legendary of these establishments stood a single, particular piece of furniture that had gradually become something close to an actual throne, a great curved bow window overlooking the busy street below. First, properly understand the fundamental nature of the club itself. It functioned as a genuine refuge, a fortress of careful exclusivity, a place where a man could finally shed the exhausting performance required on the public streets and relax fully into the company of his own kind, which is to say, other fashionable men equally devoted entirely to leisure and quiet, constant judgment. Membership was carefully, jealously controlled, admission fiercely guarded by existing members, and once safely inside, you counted yourself genuinely among the elect. The outside world, with all its tradesmen and its noisy crowds and its increasingly persistent creditors, simply could not reach you here. Within these particular walls, you remained safe to lounge freely, to drink comfortably, to talk openly, and above all, to be quietly, comfortably exclusive together with like-minded men. The clubs themselves offered every conceivable comfort a gentleman of genuine leisure might reasonably require. Fine food and even finer wine, current newspapers and comfortable easy chairs, dedicated card rooms where entire fortunes regularly changed hands overnight, and endless open hours to be filled comfortably with idle conversation and equally idle amusement. But the true underlying currency of the club, more valuable than money and considerably more valuable than the wine on offer, was simple belonging. To hold membership at the right club was to be formally certified as one of the genuinely fashionable. To be excluded from it, conversely, was to be rendered essentially nobody at all, regardless of your actual wealth or hereditary rank. The club functioned, in effect, as a carefully calibrated machine for sorting the entire world neatly into those who truly mattered and those who, ultimately, did not. And within the very grandest of these private clubs stood the single most coveted physical location in all of fashionable London, that great curved bow window jutting confidently out over the street below. This particular curved bay, added deliberately to the front of the building, became, over time, something close to the actual throne room of the Dandies. From safely within it, seated comfortably, the reigning arbiters of fashion could observe the entire passing parade of the city below, watching the whole world flow steadily while remaining themselves safely, gloriously apart from it, framed neatly in glass like the single most important exhibit housed within some grand museum of taste. To secure a seat in that particular window represented the ultimate personal arrival. It was never a seat that could simply be purchased outright, nor one that could be reasonably demanded through rank alone. It was granted, instead, purely by long-standing custom and by the tacit, considered approval of the men who already occupied it, extended only to those judged genuinely worthy of the fashionable elite's inner circle. The single great arbiter of the entire age presided personally over that window, and to be formally invited into its select company was to be officially, publicly recognized as one of the truly important men of the era. Dukes might walk casually along the street directly below. The men comfortably seated in the window decided, among themselves, whether those same dukes happened to be dressed correctly that particular afternoon. Consider for a moment the genuinely strange geometry at work here. An ordinary shop window exists to put available goods on display for passing people outside to admire and potentially purchase. This particular window operated in precise reverse. It put the fashionable men themselves on display, certainly, but it was they, seated comfortably inside, who did all the actual judging, peering steadily out at the passing crowd below and delivering silent, unappealable verdicts on absolutely everyone who happened to walk past. The people out on the pavement functioned as the exhibit. The men inside functioned as the critics. To be seen clearly from the street below, seated comfortably within that particular window, was to be marked unmistakably as someone the resident critics had already formally accepted. And the power that flowed steadily outward from that single window was entirely genuine, however patently absurd its underlying source may have been. A single raised eyebrow, one murmured passing remark. A quiet decision about precisely who was and was not worth publicly acknowledging, all of it rippled outward through the whole of fashionable society and meaningfully shaped individual reputations as a direct result. The men comfortably seated in that bow window did not govern the country in any formal sense. They did not command armies or hold any actual political office. They simply sat there, drinking quietly and judging steadily, and somehow, remarkably, that alone proved entirely sufficient to make them genuinely feared throughout the city. So you take your own place there, assuming you are considered grand enough to have properly earned it, and settle comfortably in to perform the real ongoing work of the dandy, which is to say, accomplishing almost nothing at all, but doing so with genuine, sustained magnificence. Once properly installed within his club, the true dandy accomplished something rather remarkable. He did essentially nothing at all, and yet somehow did it with genuine, undeniable magnificence. His actual power never derived from wealth, from hereditary title, or from any particular accomplishment in the ordinary sense. It derived entirely from taste, from the sheer accumulated force of his settled opinions about what was and was not fashionably acceptable. Dukes and lords would genuinely seek his personal approval, anxiously inquiring whether their new coat passed muster, whether their neckcloth had been tied correctly, whether they were, in a single word, properly done. And the dandy, lounging there with an air of profound, eternal boredom, would deliver his considered verdict, and the whole of society would, remarkably, simply obey. Let us be entirely clear about how genuinely strange this particular arrangement actually was. The men actively seeking his approval were, on paper at least, vastly more important figures than the man granting it. They possessed ancient hereditary titles, held great landed estates, occupied genuine seats of real political power, carried bloodlines stretching back for centuries. The reigning arbiter of taste, meanwhile, frequently possessed none of these advantages whatsoever, being often a man of thoroughly modest origins who had risen entirely on nerve and personal style alone. And yet the powerful came to him regardless, anxious and visibly hopeful, submitting their carefully chosen appearance for his personal judgment like nervous schoolboys presenting homework before a notoriously stern master. The entire natural order of established rank had been quietly, thoroughly turned upside down, and remarkably, everyone involved simply went along with it without much protest. The dandy's considerable authority rested almost entirely on a widely shared belief, held by all the right people, that his particular judgment on matters of taste was simply, inarguably correct in some fundamental way that could not reasonably be disputed. He had carefully cultivated an air of near-total infallibility, a serene, unshakable certainty about precisely what qualified as elegant and what qualified as dreadful. And he dispensed these considered opinions with such cool, unwavering conviction that others around him routinely accepted them as established fact. If he pronounced some particular style vulgar, it promptly became vulgar in the eyes of society. If he approved openly of some particular cut, that cut suddenly found itself in enormous demand. He functioned, in effect, as a one-man authority on what was acceptable, and his rulings were obeyed as though they somehow carried the actual force of law behind them. His manner in delivering these considered verdicts was itself a genuine art form. He never gushed with enthusiasm, never effused warmly, never stooped to anything so eager as visible delight. He lounged instead, appearing perpetually, elegantly bored, as though the entire spectacle of fashionable society amounted to little more than a mild diversion barely worthy of his full attention. From this posture of magnificent, studied ennui, he would let fall his various judgments, a single raised eyebrow here, one cool dismissive word there, a long meaningful silence that somehow spoke louder than any actual speech could have. The less he visibly appeared to care about any given matter, the more, paradoxically, everyone else seemed to care intensely about what he actually thought, a paradox every bit as true today as it evidently was then. Consider carefully what he had actually managed to build here. Out of nothing more substantial than raw confidence, genuine taste, and impeccable personal presentation, he had constructed something close to an actual throne for himself. He had somehow convinced the most powerful people in the entire country that being the single best dressed, most quietly cutting man in any given room constituted a genuine form of real authority, one worth actively courting and genuinely fearing in equal measure. It was, examined coldly and without sentiment, one of the more audacious confidence schemes in the entirety of social history, and its particular brilliance lay in the fact that essentially everyone involved was, on some level, in on the joke, and the whole arrangement worked splendidly anyway. The comparison to our present moment is almost too easy to draw. We still, every one of us, grant a similarly strange power to the recognized arbiters of taste around us, the people who simply seem to know intuitively what is cool and what is not, whose approval we quietly crave, and whose open disdain we genuinely dread, even when they hold no actual formal power over our lives whatsoever. The dandy represented, in many ways, the original version of exactly this phenomenon, the founding member of a club that has never once, in all the years since, stopped admitting eager new members. He proved conclusively that taste itself, when wielded with sufficient unwavering confidence, could reliably be transformed into a genuine kind of governing rule. And any ruler, naturally, requires subjects to govern, which means he also requires some reliable method of punishing those subjects who dare to displease him. The dandy possessed precisely such a punishment, exquisite in its particular cruelty, and requiring not a single raised voice or lifted hand to properly execute. It was known, simply, as the cut. In this glittering, watchful world, the deadliest available weapon was never a sword or a loaded pistol. It was, instead, the simple, deliberate refusal to acknowledge that another person even existed. This constituted the fine art of the snub, gradually refined over time into an entire ranked system of quiet social annihilation. The gentlest available version involved simply failing to notice a passing acquaintance. But the true killing blow, the nuclear option available within this particular social arsenal, was known formally as the cut direct, looking a person squarely in the eye in full view of everyone present who mattered socially, and then deliberately, visibly turning away as though they amounted to nothing more than a passing smudge in the air. To properly understand the real power of the cut, you first have to understand just how genuinely starved this entire society was for basic acknowledgement. Everything within it ran on recognition, on the small, constant exchanges of nods and bows and greetings that continuously reaffirmed precisely who remained socially relevant and who did not. To be greeted warmly by the right people was to be woven securely, moment by moment, into the very fabric of respectable society. Your existence, at least in a purely social sense, was continuously confirmed through the ongoing acknowledgement extended by others around you, which meant, naturally, that the deliberate withdrawal of that acknowledgement was never merely a minor slight. It amounted, in a very real sense, to a kind of social erasure. The available snub came in carefully graded intensities, rather like a menu of calibrated cruelty. At the milder end of the scale, you might simply fail to notice someone entirely, letting your gaze drift casually past them as though genuinely distracted by something else entirely. A gentle enough message that they were, for whatever reason, not quite worth your full attention that particular day. This could plausibly be dismissed afterward as simple absent-mindedness, but it planted a small, persistent seed of doubt both in the victim's mind and in the minds of everyone else watching regarding exactly where that person actually stood socially. Then there was the full, truly terrible cut direct, the absolute masterpiece of the entire form. This required establishing clear eye contact first, one unmistakable moment in which you looked directly at the targeted person, so that there could be absolutely no plausible pretense afterward that you had simply failed to notice them. And then, having firmly established beyond any reasonable doubt that you had seen them perfectly clearly, you turned deliberately, coldly away, as though what you had actually seen was not a person at all, but rather an empty patch of air, nothing whatsoever, a complete nobody unworthy of even the smallest flicker of genuine recognition. Delivered in a crowded room before the watchful eyes of everyone who actually mattered socially, it proved genuinely devastating every single time. The particular genius of the maneuver lay in the fact that it technically broke no established rule and consequently could never really be answered or contested. There was no specific insult to formally object to, no actual blow to return in kind, no particular words to dispute or challenge afterward. You had, technically speaking, done absolutely nothing beyond simply declining to greet someone, which does not constitute any kind of formal crime, and yet everyone present understood with perfect clarity exactly what had just happened. They had personally witnessed a living person be publicly unmade, watched their entire social standing collapse within the brief space of a single turned shoulder. The victim could not meaningfully fight back without appearing genuinely hysterical in the process, could not protest openly without inadvertently confirming their own diminished status. They could only stand there, freshly erased in front of everyone, and quietly absorb the collective judgment of the room settling over them. A truly well-delivered cut, executed by precisely the right dandy at precisely the right moment, could genuinely damage a person's reputation beyond easy repair, sending an ambitious social climber tumbling straight back down the very ladder they had worked so hard and so long to climb. Doors that had previously been slowly opening would quietly, permanently close. Invitations that had once arrived regularly would simply fail to appear anymore. The cut functioned as a clear signal to the whole of society that this particular person had fallen decisively out of favor, and society itself, ever eager to faithfully follow the lead set by its recognized arbiters, would adjust its collective treatment of them accordingly, and without much further discussion. One correctly applied cold shoulder could genuinely ripple outward into very real and remarkably lasting consequences. You recognize this particular dynamic instinctively, of course, because the underlying impulse never actually died out. The pointed, deliberate failure to acknowledge someone, the calculated looking through of a person you have quietly decided no longer counts for anything, remains today one of the most genuinely cruel and thoroughly bloodless weapons available to human beings. The dandies simply perfected the technique, assigned it careful grades and formal rules, and elevated the humble snub into something close to a genuine fine art. But the cut represented only a weapon of pure silence, and the dandy proved equally deadly when it came to sound. If clothing served as the dandy's armor, his wit functioned as his blade, and he kept that blade genuinely razor-sharp at all times. Within these gilded, watchful rooms, a man's tongue could reliably carry him considerably further than his actual fortune ever could, and the most celebrated dandies of the age were feared not for their fists, but specifically for their remarks, delivered coolly and with apparent casualness, and yet utterly devastating in their eventual effect. A perfectly timed insult, carefully dressed up as an entirely polite observation, could reduce a rival to complete social rubble while the entire watching room pretended, with great effort, to be admiring the wallpaper instead. Wit, in this particular world, was never mere entertainment. It functioned as a genuine survival skill, a recognized form of open combat, and a reliable ladder toward the very top of society. A man of relatively modest birth and genuinely empty pockets could never hope to fight his way successfully into the fashionable elite through money or bloodline alone, since he possessed neither in any meaningful quantity. But a genuinely devastating tongue remained available to anyone sufficiently clever enough to properly wield it, and an established reputation for real wit could reliably open doors that gold alone simply could not. The single right remark, delivered at precisely the right moment, could transform you into the single most talked-about man in London by the very next morning, and being widely talked about within a society that essentially ran on constant gossip, amounted to a currency considerably more valuable than any actual coin. The true craft of it lay almost entirely in the delivery. A crude insult shouted out in open anger was worth essentially nothing, marking a man who had visibly lost control of himself. The genuine art instead involved wounding with real elegance, delivering the killing line so casually, so lightly wrapped within the neat form of an entirely polite remark, that it seemed to fall from your lips almost by pure accident. You never appeared to be visibly trying. You never seemed openly cruel in the moment. You simply made an observation, cool and offhand, that happened, almost incidentally, to leave your intended target in complete social ruins, while you gaze serenely off toward something else entirely. That apparent effortlessness represented absolutely everything in this particular art form. A joke that appeared visibly labored over was, by definition, a joke that had already failed, and the entire watching room functioned as your personal stage in these moments. An insult delivered strictly in private amounted to little more than an ordinary disagreement between two people. That same insult delivered before a full audience of the fashionable elite became instead a genuine public execution, witnessed closely, relished thoroughly, and repeated endlessly afterward. The very best lines never simply died in the room where they had originally been spoken. They traveled steadily onward, carried from club to drawing room to dinner table, growing more polished and more devastating with each successive retelling, until eventually the whole of fashionable society had heard precisely how so-and-so had been thoroughly demolished by a single perfect sentence. A man could genuinely build an entire lasting reputation on nothing more than a small handful of memorable remarks that simply refused to be forgotten by anyone who heard them. But here lay the genuine danger, the sharp edge that inevitably cut both ways in the end. That same razor wit that reliably lifted a man upward also, just as reliably, made him serious enemies along the way, and not every enemy made in this fashion proved entirely safe to acquire. Mocking a genuine nobody cost you essentially nothing at all. The nobody in question possessed no real power to strike back in any meaningful way. But the fashionable world constituted an intricate, interconnected web of the genuinely powerful, and somewhere within that particular web sat people who could, if sufficiently provoked, end a man's career and reputation entirely. People whose considerable vanity you wounded only at your own genuine peril. A remark that had seemed gloriously daring and clever in the immediate moment could curdle, given enough time, into a truly fatal miscalculation, once the wrong person eventually decided they had been humiliated one time too many to simply let pass. This represented the tightrope that every genuinely witty dandy walked continuously, whether he consciously admitted it to himself or not. His considerable genius for wit was simultaneously his single greatest liability. The enthusiastic applause that greeted his sharpest lines only encouraged him further, pushing him to aim higher still, to risk considerably more with each attempt, and the higher he consistently aimed, the greater and more catastrophic the eventual fall if he seriously misjudged his intended target. Live persistently by the joke, and you may very well in time die by it as well, undone entirely by a single line spoken carelessly to a man who ultimately proved unwilling to laugh along. The most famous dandy of the entire age would eventually learn this particular lesson in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Aiming a single joke at the one man in all of England, it was genuinely, seriously dangerous to mock. But that particular reckoning still waits somewhat further ahead in our story. For now, there remained softer battlefields still to conquer, none more exclusive or more genuinely absurd than a certain set of assembly rooms where the refreshments were famously terrible, and the front door itself was guarded like an actual fortress. Let's turn now to the single most exclusive room in the whole of England, a place so rigorously selective that simply being admitted was widely considered one of society's very highest honors, the assembly rooms known simply as Almacks. On the surface, the whole thing sounds fairly harmless, a modest venue for dancing, weak tea, and famously unimpressive cake that became something of a running joke throughout fashionable society. The refreshments served there were, by every reliable account, genuinely dreadful, and yet men and women drawn from the very highest ranks of society schemed constantly, begged persistently, and groveled shamelessly for the simple privilege of walking through those particular doors on a Wednesday evening. Let us begin properly with the sheer, glorious absurdity of the refreshments themselves, because this single detail somehow tells you almost everything you need to know. The food and drink routinely on offer were, by essentially every surviving account, genuinely miserable, thin bread and butter, dry unremarkable cake, weak tea and equally weak lemonade, precisely the sort of modest spread that would embarrass even an unremarkable ordinary household, let alone the single most coveted room in the entire kingdom. There was no real feast to speak of, no flowing wine of any quality, no indulgence whatsoever, and remarkably, none of this seemed to matter in the slightest, because genuinely nobody came to Almack's for the food. They came, instead, purely to be admitted, and that admission itself constituted the entire point of the exercise. This single fact represents the real key to understanding the place properly. Almack sold nothing whatsoever except exclusivity itself, in its purest, most concentrated available form. The actual value never resided in whatever happened once you were safely inside. The dancing itself was pleasant enough in a modest way, the company generally fine, but none of it genuinely justified the frantic, ongoing scheming required simply to gain entry in the first place. The real value resided entirely in the getting in the simple fact that so very many hopeful applicants were kept firmly out. To pass successfully through those particular doors was to be formally certified as belonging to the very highest tier of respectable society. To be refused entry, conversely, was to be told publicly and quite unmistakably that you did not. And so the genuinely powerful found themselves humbling themselves considerably for even a modest chance at admission. Wealthy men, titled men, men thoroughly accustomed to obtaining absolutely anything they wished through money or rank alone, suddenly found themselves in the deeply strange position of having to beg politely, to angle carefully, to actively court favor, all purely for the sake of a single Wednesday evening spent eating bad cake within one particular exclusive room. Wealth alone could never simply buy your way inside. Rank alone could never force the door open. You had to be personally granted admission, and that granting rested entirely in the hands of a small, genuinely merciless authority we shall properly meet in just a moment. The dress code enforced at the door was treated as something close to sacred, upheld with a rigidity that bordered on genuine comedy. Gentlemen were required, without exception, to appear in strict formal attire, knee breeches without fail, paired with a proper white neckcloth, leaving absolutely no room whatsoever for personal interpretation or fashionable rebellion of any kind. This represented one of the very last strongholds where the older order of breeches held complete, unquestioned sway, and the increasingly popular newfangled trousers we discussed earlier were, quite simply, strictly forbidden within these particular walls. It made no difference whatsoever how modern or personally magnificent you otherwise happened to be. The established rule remained the rule, and the rule, without exception, was breeches. To properly illustrate just how absolute this particular standard truly was, consider the most famous documented casualty of that unforgiving door. The story, cherished and retold ever since among London society, holds that even the great military hero of the entire age, the very man who had personally defeated the terror of Europe on the battlefield, was once turned away entirely from Almack's for the simple crime of arriving incorrectly dressed. If the celebrated conqueror of Napoleon himself could be flatly refused entry over a mere matter of leg wear, then genuinely no one, absolutely no one, could consider themselves safe from the same fate. The rule bowed to no established rank whatsoever, no accumulated reputation, no measure of battlefield glory. It bowed, in the end, only to itself. Pause for a moment on the sheer wonder contained in that particular episode. A society that openly revered its military heroes, that showered its own victorious generals with every available honor, would nonetheless still shut the door firmly in one's face if he happened to arrive wearing the wrong trousers. It stands as a rather perfect little monument to the true priorities governing this particular fashionable world, where the correctly tied neckcloth apparently outranked the salvation of an entire continent, at least on any given Wednesday evening. But who exactly held this genuinely terrifying power over the door, the considerable power to humble celebrated heroes and reject the merely wealthy without a second thought? Not the men comfortably seated in the bow window, not even the recognized arbiters of the clubs. Instead, a small circle of formidable, aristocratic women, and their collective word, once given, was entirely final. So who exactly held the keys to this glittering, cake-deficient little paradise? Not kings, not dukes. A small, carefully selected committee of aristocratic women, formerly known as the patronesses, and they ruled over the entire social season with something close to an iron fist wrapped, quite deliberately, in a silk glove. Admission to Almack's required a formal voucher, and only these particular ladies possessed the authority to grant one, which meant, in practical terms, that a small handful of powerful women effectively decided who belonged within polite society and who was cast, quite deliberately, into outer social darkness. Picture the underlying arrangement carefully, because it truly is remarkable when examined closely. In a world where men held nearly all formal political and legal power, where women could not vote, could not sit in parliament, could rarely control their own property once safely married, a tiny circle of great ladies had somehow managed to carve out an entire kingdom belonging entirely to themselves. Within the walls of the most exclusive rooms in all of London, their authority remained genuinely absolute, and the grandest men in the entire country had no real choice but to submit quietly to it. It stood as one of the very few arenas within this whole society where women reigned entirely without question, and they did not, by any account, reign gently. The voucher itself functioned as the actual instrument of their considerable power. A small printed ticket that, in practice, meant absolutely everything. Without one in hand, you simply did not enter, regardless of who you happened to be. And these particular vouchers were never available for purchase at any price, could never be demanded through rank, could never be won through any conceivable amount of accumulated wealth. They were granted, instead, entirely personally, at the pleasure of the patronesses, extended only to those they personally judged worthy, and withheld just as personally from anyone they judged otherwise. Every single voucher represented a considered judgment made flesh, a clear statement that this particular person belonged and that one, regrettably, did not, and the ladies dispensed them with all the careful attention and occasional cruelty of reigning monarchs handing out formal titles. To successfully secure a voucher, you were obliged to court the patronesses directly, and courting them properly amounted to a genuinely delicate, often quietly humiliating art form. You had to appear pleasing without ever seeming presumptuous, visibly present without ever seeming pushy, charming throughout without ever appearing to try too hard for something you were, according to the prevailing social code, supposed to be entirely above wanting in the first place. A single wrong word, one poorly judged remark, even the faintest hint of arrogance, any of these small missteps could cost you the whole endeavor. And once you had genuinely displeased one of these formidable women, mercy tended to be in remarkably short supply thereafter. They possessed notoriously long memories and felt no particular obligation whatsoever to explain their reasoning to anyone. The power these women wielded reached considerably further than the door of a single assembly room. To be formally admitted to Almack's was to be publicly stamped as belonging firmly to the elite, and that particular stamp shaped essentially everything that followed. The invitations you subsequently received, the marriages you might realistically hope to make, the doors that either opened readily or remained firmly shut across the whole of fashionable London society. By carefully controlling admission to this single room, the patronesses effectively controlled the actual borders of high society itself, deciding personally who was permitted to cross safely into the charmed inner circle, and who was left, indefinitely, pressing their face uselessly against the glass from outside. And here lies the particular detail that ought to give every strutting, self-assured dandy real pause. For all his considerable power within the clubs, for all his devastating cuts and widely celebrated wit, even the mightiest recognized arbiter of male fashion still had to mind his manners carefully around these particular women. He might comfortably rule the bow window, might make dukes genuinely anxious about the state of their neckcloths, might reduce open rivals to complete rubble with a single well-aimed line, but he could never simply grant himself a voucher, and he could never force the patronesses to personally favor him. Within their particular kingdom, he remained a supplicant exactly like everyone else, and if he happened to cross them seriously, they could quietly, permanently shut him out of the very society he supposedly, in every other context, commanded. It stands as a genuinely bracing reminder tucked away inside all this male vanity and posturing. The men strutted about and postured endlessly, imagining themselves the true masters of the fashionable world, but a determined circle of clever, well-connected women held a particular set of keys the men could simply never manage to take for themselves, and they guarded those keys with a genuinely formidable will throughout the entire era. Now, with the door successfully cleared behind us, let us follow the fashionable crowd onward to the tables where considerably greater fortunes than a mere social voucher were regularly won, and far more often, catastrophically lost. Now we arrive at the great destroyer, the beautiful monster lurking patiently at the very heart of dandy life, gambling. Behind the exclusive closed doors of the fashionable clubs, entire fortunes were routinely won, and far more often utterly obliterated, across the green baize tables during a single feverish, sleepless night. Card games and various games of pure chance, bearing names now largely half forgotten, drew steady crowds of glassy-eyed gentlemen who casually wagered sums considerable enough to have purchased entire landed estates, all riding on nothing more substantial than the turn of a single card or the roll of a pair of dice. Gambling was woven so thoroughly, so deeply into the fabric of fashionable life that it functioned almost as a formal social duty. This represented how gentlemen of genuine leisure reliably filled their endless idle nights, and the stakes involved were never the modest amounts wagered by men playing purely for casual amusement. These were staggering sums, wagered with an air of studied, cool indifference, as though the money itself meant genuinely nothing at all, which for a certain particular kind of dandy amounted to precisely the pose he was actively working to strike. To bet truly enormous sums with an air of complete cool indifference was to demonstrate publicly that you were so grand, so entirely above mere vulgar commerce, that a fortune more or less simply did not trouble you in the slightest. The real trouble, naturally, was that, for most of these men it very much did trouble them, whatever face they managed to put on for the room. The games themselves functioned as genuine engines of ruin. Some turned entirely on blind chance, on the simple fall of dice or the flip of a single card, with no meaningful skill whatsoever to shelter behind and no clever strategy available to slow the inevitable bleeding of one's fortune. A man could sit down at the table perfectly whole and rise again only a few hours later, thoroughly destroyed, his entire family inheritance transferred silently across the table by nothing more than sheer, indifferent luck. One particular fashionable club became so notorious for its genuinely ruinous high-stakes play that it effectively gambled itself directly into complete oblivion, its own members losing so relentlessly and so spectacularly, night after night, that the entire establishment eventually collapsed under the accumulated weight of it all, an entire institution ultimately undone by the very appetite it had originally existed to serve and feed. The dandy's unwritten code made this whole dangerous business considerably more perilous still by strictly forbidding any visible show of genuine distress. You could lose absolutely everything at the table, but you could never, under any circumstances, appear to actually care about it, to wince visibly, to sweat noticeably, to betray even the slightest flicker of genuine anguish as your entire fortune quietly vanished before your eyes. That would have marked you, immediately and unmistakably, as a man who was not, in the truest sense, a proper gentleman at all. So they lost, consistently, with practiced smiles firmly fixed in place. They joked lightly even as they signed away their entire futures in ink, made deliberately light of genuine catastrophe, and rose calmly from the table with an easy shrug and some witty parting remark, all while the ground itself quietly gave way completely beneath their feet. This particular composure was widely admired throughout society. It also, quite clearly, amounted to a genuine kind of madness when examined honestly. There existed a cruel, glaring double standard buried right at the heart of these accumulating debts. A debt incurred honestly at the gaming table was treated as a sacred debt of honor, binding absolutely, to be settled promptly and entirely without question, because to welsh openly on a gambling debt was to disgrace yourself utterly and completely among your own social peers. Yet the parallel debt owed to an honest tailor, to a hardworking bootmaker, to a patient wine merchant, to any tradesman who had actually provided real goods and genuine labor in good faith, could be left comfortably unpaid for years on end, without any comparable sense of shame attaching to it whatsoever. A gentleman would willingly ruin himself entirely to properly settle a card debt owed to a fellow dandy, while cheerfully, indefinitely stiffing the very craftsman who had personally made his coat. The underlying logic here remains genuinely baffling until you fully accept one core truth. It was never really about fairness at all. It was entirely about status, and only the considered opinions of one's own social kind ever truly counted for anything. This particular appetite for the tables represented the worm quietly eating away at the very core of the whole glittering apple. The entire dandy world ran on the constant appearance of limitless available wealth, but appearance, as it turns out, is never quite the same thing as actual underlying substance. And the gaming table represented precisely the place where that critical difference eventually, inevitably caught up with a man. Fortunes that had taken multiple generations to carefully build could be scattered entirely within a single reckless evening, and no amount of perfect tailoring could ever manage to stitch them properly back together again afterward. But we're getting somewhat ahead of ourselves here, moving too quickly toward the eventual reckoning. There remained, for now, still further pleasures genuinely worth enjoying, small further rituals still to perform, and one of the most fashionable among them involved nothing more than a small pinch of brown powder and a genuinely, absurdly expensive little box. In between all the elaborate dressing, the leisurely strolling, and the ruinous gambling, a proper dandy still required something suitably graceful to occupy his idle hands with, and the answer, quite reliably, was snuff. Snuff amounted to finely powdered tobacco, sniffed directly up the nose, and the actual act of taking it mattered considerably less than the surrounding ceremony built up around it. A true connoisseur maintained an entire personal collection of exquisite little boxes, jeweled, enameled, and priced at levels bordering on the genuinely absurd, and the full ritual of producing one, flicking it open with a single practiced thumb, taking a careful pinch, and inhaling with perfect, unhurried poise amounted to its own small, self-contained performance. The underlying habit itself remained fairly simple in mechanical terms. A small quantity of finely ground tobacco was placed either at the back of the hand or held delicately in a pinch between two fingers, then inhaled sharply upward into the nose. The resulting effect was a brisk little jolt from the tobacco itself, typically followed by some genuine sniffing, and if one rather overdid the quantity, an entirely spectacular and thoroughly undignified sneeze soon followed. But the actual pharmacological effect remained almost entirely beside the point. What genuinely mattered was precisely how you performed the whole affair, the particular grace and considered style you brought to it, because taking snuff functioned as a small stage on which any properly fashionable man could perform his own refinement several times across a single day. The box itself represented the true glory of the entire ritual. A serious devotee owned not merely one box but an entire collection of them, each individual piece a small masterpiece produced by the jeweler's or enameler's considerable art, worked carefully in gold and other precious materials, painted with tiny detailed scenes, studded with decoration, and worth genuine small fortunes in their own right. A man might reasonably maintain a different box entirely for different occasions or different moods, and displaying precisely the right box at precisely the right moment became its own quiet way of announcing your considerable taste and accumulated wealth without saying a single word aloud. These objects were never mere containers in any meaningful sense. They functioned as genuine jewels a man carried about and flourished openly, tiny portable declarations of his overall standing, and the entire ritual of using them properly was choreographed down to a genuinely fine art. The truly accomplished practitioners could produce the box, open it cleanly, and take a proper pinch entirely with a single hand, flicking the lid open with the thumb in one smooth, thoroughly practiced motion that clearly separated the genuine adept from the fumbling amateur beginner. Connoisseurs approached the entire business with tremendous, unironic seriousness, debating different blends the way other men might debate a fine vintage of wine, keeping different varieties on hand for different occasions, discussing the relative merits of one particular mixture over another with all the gravity of recognized experts. A gentleman might take genuine pride in the quality and relative rarity of his personal snuff, in having reliable access to particular blends other men simply could not obtain elsewhere, and offering someone else a pinch directly from your own box represented a small, meaningful social gesture, a courtesy capable of flattering the recipient, or, if pointedly withheld from the wrong person entirely, delivering a subtle but unmistakable snub. Was any of this genuinely good for a person's health? Not remotely. The habit left a man sniffing and occasionally sneezing at deeply inopportune moments, could stain the fingers and the fabulously expensive linen he had worked so hard to keep pristine throughout the day, and filled his otherwise fashionable rooms with a faint, persistent haze of brown dust that settled steadily onto everything within reach. It amounted, in the plainest possible terms, to a messy, thoroughly unhealthy, largely pointless indulgence dressed up carefully in golden ceremony. But that particular description, honestly, could apply equally well to a great deal of dandy life more broadly, and it never once stopped anyone from continuing the habit regardless. What Snuff genuinely offered was a reliable occupation for otherwise idle hands and a regular chance to perform for an audience. And the dandy, after all, was always performing for someone. Believe it or not, being a proper dandy was never entirely about lounging comfortably, sneering quietly, and slowly going bankrupt in the background. A genuinely fashionable gentleman was also expected to appear reasonably sporting, or at the very least to convincingly look the part when required. So off you go, periodically, to the boxing saloon run by a celebrated former champion, where assorted lords and dandies pulled on padded gloves and learned the supposedly manly science of pugilism directly from a genuine former prize fighter, largely so they could discuss the experience afterward at considerable length. The boxing saloon functioned as a genuinely fashionable institution in its own right, presided over by a celebrated former champion who had traded the brutal reality of the actual prize ring for the considerably more comfortable business of teaching wealthy gentlemen how to properly throw a punch. Here, within a perfectly respectable establishment, the sons of the aristocracy and the leading men of fashion would strip down to their shirt sleeves, pull on padded gloves, and spar together under expert professional guidance. It was known formally as the manly art, sometimes the noble science, and it lent any fashionable gentleman a welcome air of physical vigor and toughness, a subtle suggestion that beneath all that perfect tailoring lay a man genuinely capable of handling himself if the situation ever demanded it. Whether these particular gentlemen could actually handle themselves in any real confrontation remained, for most of them, an entirely separate question. For the majority, the boxing amounted to a fairly genteel imitation of the real thing, a controlled, padded version conducted comfortably among social equals in perfectly pleasant surroundings, a considerable world away from the genuinely bloody bare-knuckle contests of the actual professional prize ring. But this distinction hardly mattered in practice. The real point was simply to have trained personally with the famous champion, to be able to casually mention the fact afterward, to carry the faint borrowed glamour of the fighting world back into the comfortable drawing room. A gentleman who could truthfully claim he had sparred at the great man's saloon had acquired a genuinely valuable little piece of reputation for himself, entirely regardless of whether he could actually land a decent blow when it counted. Fencing offered a broadly similar arrangement, carrying with it a considerably longer and sharper historical pedigree. At the academies run by fashionable fencing masters, gentlemen learned the elegant footwork and precise blade work associated with swordsmanship, an art carrying centuries of accumulated aristocratic prestige behind it. It was graceful, genuinely disciplined, and physically demanding, and it made a man look wonderful while practicing it, all poised limbs and carefully controlled movement, which amounted to at least half the actual motivation for taking it up in the first place. Learning to fence properly was a way of claiming a small piece of the old warrior nobility for oneself, of quietly suggesting that one was not merely decorative but genuinely capable in a pinch, a man of real action dressed in a beautifully cut shirt. There existed, beneath all the obvious posing, a genuinely practical edge to these particular pursuits, and it was not always a comfortable one to consider. This remained, after all, a world in which certain insults could not always simply be laughed off or ignored, in which serious matters of personal honor between gentlemen might occasionally end not with a witty remark, but with a formal, genuinely deadly confrontation. Duels, though increasingly frowned upon by this point and technically illegal, still happened with some regularity, and a man who had seriously offended the wrong person might well find himself facing loaded pistols or drawn blades at dawn. In that particular grim light, knowing how to properly handle a sword or absorb a punch was never merely fashionable affectation. It amounted to a genuine form of practical insurance, a hedge against the day when clever wit alone would prove entirely insufficient to save him. So the dandy sweated decorously within the very best available establishments, learning to fight properly in ways he mostly, sincerely hoped never to actually need. It fit neatly into the whole broader pattern of his entire life, this particular blend of genuine skill and pure surface performance, of real underlying training put mostly, if not entirely, to the service of maintaining reputation. He wanted, above all, to be seen as capable, even faintly dangerous, while spending the great majority of his actual days in about the safest, most comfortable version of danger that available money could reasonably arrange. And when he genuinely wished to combine his fashionable vigor with real, tangible peril, there existed one particular pursuit offering speed, public spectacle, and a very real chance of outright catastrophe, all conveniently in front of the largest possible audience. For a dandy specifically wishing to combine fashion with the very real risk of sudden death, there was truly nothing finer available than driving. The absolute height of sporting style involved personally handling a light, fast carriage pulled by beautifully matched horses, ideally at a pace genuinely terrifying to ordinary pedestrians and thoroughly delightful to admiring onlookers. There even existed fashionable clubs devoted entirely to gentlemen who took particular pride in personally driving teams of 4 horses at once, dressing the part in elaborate coachman-inspired outfits, and thundering along public roads in a display of reckless, thoroughly moneyed confidence. Understand first exactly what kind of status symbol the right carriage actually represented. A light, fast, elegant vehicle drawn by horses whose color and stride had been matched with genuinely obsessive care, ranked among the most conspicuous possible displays of wealth and taste a man could make. It proved expensive to purchase outright, expensive to properly maintain, and expensive to stock reliably with the finest available animals, and it announced all of that considerable expense openly to absolutely everyone who happened to see it flash past on the road. To personally drive your own smart carriage, reins held confidently in hand, was to broadcast clearly that you were wealthy, genuinely sporting, and daringly modern in your outlook, A man who handled his own driving purely for the sheer style of it rather than sitting meekly behind some hired coachman. The truly devoted took the whole pursuit considerably further still, forming dedicated fashionable clubs built specifically around the demanding skill of driving a full team of 4 horses simultaneously, a genuine feat requiring real ability and no small measure of raw nerve. These particular gentlemen would deck themselves out in elaborate outfits directly inspired by professional working coachmen, adopting the dress of ordinary laboring drivers as a kind of fashionable costume, then set off together in company to properly display both their skill and their impressive turnouts. There was something delightfully absurd embedded in the whole spectacle, wealthy men enthusiastically playing at being coachmen, dressing up convincingly as the very laborers they would never actually dream of becoming in reality, all purely in pursuit of a particular sporting glamour. The grand stage for all this display was the park, where at the fashionable hour each afternoon the beautiful people of London gathered together to ride and drive along one particularly celebrated stretch of open ground. This amounted to the Promenade all over again, only considerably faster, grander, and rather more genuinely dangerous. Here the fashionable set paraded openly on horseback and within their finest carriages, seeing and quite deliberately being seen. The whole glittering competition previously confined to the streets now transferred wholesale to a setting of open ground and thundering hooves. To move confidently through that watching crowd in a genuinely fine turnout, handling your team with visible cool skill, was to occupy the very center of the fashionable world for that particular afternoon. But speed and public spectacle came bundled together with genuine peril, and that danger was, in its own way, rather the entire point of the exercise. A light carriage driven at speed by a relative amateur amounted to a genuine accident simply waiting patiently to happen. And accidents, naturally, happened regularly enough. Horses occasionally bolted without warning, wheels caught badly on uneven ground, vehicles overturned suddenly, spilling their fashionable drivers unceremoniously onto the ground before the largest and most openly judgmental audience available anywhere in London. To crash under these circumstances represented a humiliation of the very first order, a thoroughly public unmasking of a man who had confidently claimed a skill he did not, in fact, actually possess. But to drive with genuine perfection, to handle your team with apparently careless mastery while everyone else present simply gawked in admiration, was to be celebrated as a truly accomplished sporting gentleman. And the very real risk of that first humiliating outcome was precisely what made the second, triumphant outcome so genuinely glorious by comparison. It captures the entire dandy spirit rather neatly, this whole particular business of driving. Enormous expense, genuine physical danger, real underlying skill, and pure surface performance, all braided tightly together in a single pursuit whose true underlying purpose was simply to be watched, admired, and quietly envied by everyone present. He risked his own neck purely for style, spent fortunes he could scarcely afford on horses and elaborate carriages, and did it all with precisely the studied indifference that marked him unmistakably as one of his particular kind. Yet even as he thundered proudly through the park looking thoroughly magnificent, the dandy was simultaneously fighting a quieter, considerably more personal battle. Waged not against any rival driver, but against his own increasingly stubborn body, and its persistent refusal to remain fashionably thin. That flawless, carefully sculpted silhouette we admired so thoroughly earlier came, inevitably, at a real and ongoing price, and part of that price was measured in food, or rather, in the tragic, deliberate lack of it. And so began some of recorded history's more genuinely miserable personal diets. The great trendsetter of the entire age was widely known for eating remarkably little at any given meal, picking delicately at plain vegetables, and treating anything resembling a genuinely hearty meal as something bordering on a real moral failing. The underlying problem here was structural, quite literally so. Everything about the dandy's carefully constructed dress demanded a lean, tapering figure, the narrow waist, the closely cut coat, the clinging pantaloons that concealed absolutely nothing beneath them. There existed no comfortable room whatsoever within that particular silhouette for the soft comfort that comes so naturally to a man who dines and drinks generously and well on a regular nightly basis. And dine and drink generously they most certainly, reliably did. The fashionable life itself amounted to one long, continuous procession of rich dinners, freely flowing wine, and late suppers stretching into the night, all of which conspired directly against the very slimness the prevailing fashion so strictly required. Something inevitably had to give under this pressure, and quite often what gave first was simply the ordinary pleasure of eating. The leading arbiter of taste set the prevailing tone here, exactly as he did in virtually every other fashionable matter, reportedly eating with an almost aggressive personal restraint, favoring genuinely modest portions of the plainest possible food, and regarding any overindulgence at the dinner table as fundamentally beneath a truly elegant man. To pick delicately at one's plate, to appear genuinely indifferent to food altogether, to treat the ordinary appetite as something requiring active mastery rather than simple obedience, this constituted the properly fashionable posture of the age. A gentleman of genuine refinement did not fall eagerly upon his dinner the way a hungry laborer might. He trifled with it instead, as though the whole business of eating amounted to little more than a mildly tiresome necessity he could easily take or leave at will. Others pursued this particular quest for slimness to genuinely alarming extremes, and here the fashionable diet crossed decisively into something closer to outright self-torture. One celebrated figure of the age, a man of considerable fame and considerable private terror at the prospect of growing visibly stout, subjected himself repeatedly to punishing personal regimes, specifically designed to keep excess flesh off his frame at essentially any cost. He would live for extended stretches on the most meager, joyless possible fare imaginable, sustaining himself on nothing more than thin, dry biscuits and plain soda water, or on potatoes soaked directly in vinegar, and various other grim, largely self-punishing experiments in eating as little actual nourishment as a human body could reasonably be made to endure over time. It amounted, in plain terms, to genuine starvation dressed up carefully as personal discipline, and it took a very real, measurable toll on his health over time. The underlying goal of all this considerable suffering was one particular look, and it was decidedly not the look of robust, glowing physical health. The fashionable ideal of the moment was pale, notably lean, and faintly interesting in appearance. The overall look of a man too refined, too preoccupied with loftier things to bother much with ordinary food. A certain delicacy, even a hint of visible physical fragility, was actively admired within this particular social circle, suggesting a sensitive soul who lived essentially on air and personal elegance rather than mutton and pudding. Ruddy, obvious good health looked distinctly coarse by comparison. Pale slenderness, by contrast, looked genuinely poetic. And so these men starved themselves steadily toward an aesthetic that, in the end, simply prized the exact look that genuine hunger naturally produces on its own. There is something painfully familiar buried within all of this, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise here. The underlying idea that one must actively suffer, must deliberately deny the body, must wage a kind of constant private war against one's own natural appetite in relentless pursuit of some fashionable shape, did not begin with the dandies, and it certainly did not end with them either. They simply pursued the goal with the very same obsessive intensity they brought to absolutely everything else in their lives, chasing thinness through vinegar and soda water and sheer, grim willpower, and calling the resulting misery elegance. But no honest account of the dandy's remarkable rise and eventual catastrophic fall can reasonably avoid the one particular relationship that lifted him to his very highest point, and then, in time, destroyed him more completely than anything else ever could. His close personal friendship with the single most powerful man in the entire land. No proper account of the Dandies' world could ever be considered complete without the Prince Regent himself, the future king, affectionately nicknamed by the fashionable set. For one glorious, extended stretch, the reigning arbiter of taste and the royal heir apparent were the very closest of personal companions, a partnership that lifted the once humble dandy to genuinely dizzying social heights. Because if the prince himself laughed openly at your particular jokes and eagerly copied the cut of your coats, then the whole of society naturally fell obediently into line right behind him without further question. Consider carefully what this particular friendship genuinely meant for a man of no especially great birth. The prince stood as heir apparent to the throne itself, the very center of the entire fashionable universe, the singular figure around whom all of high society quietly revolved. To be counted among his intimates, his trusted companion, the one man whose taste he genuinely admired and whose company he actively sought out, was to be handed, in effect, a golden key unlocking absolutely everything. The reigning arbiter of style, a man who had risen entirely on nerve and carefully tied neckcloths rather than ancient bloodline, suddenly found himself walking comfortably beside actual royalty, and the whole of watching society took very careful note of the fact. If the future king himself treated this particular man as a genuine equal, as a true friend, as a recognized authority on matters of taste, then who exactly could possibly question his elevated standing afterward? The partnership clearly suited both men involved. At least for a considerable time. The prince himself, thoroughly devoted to fashion, to extravagance, and to pleasure generally, delighted openly in the wit and impeccable style of his particular companion, and the resulting association burnished the dandy's own authority to an almost blinding shine. Together the two of them effectively set the prevailing tone for the whole of fashionable London, the prince contributing genuine royal weight to the arrangement, the dandy contributing taste and cutting personal brilliance in return. It was, for that particular season, a genuinely mutually flattering arrangement, and the dandy rode it confidently all the way to the very summit of the entire social world. But friendships built primarily on flattery and shared personal vanity tend to be genuinely brittle things underneath the surface, and this particular one carried the seeds of its own eventual destruction from fairly early on. The prince himself was proud and increasingly sensitive on the subject, particularly regarding his own steadily expanding figure, which the fashionable life of rich dinners and late nights had not been especially kind to over the years. The dandy, meanwhile, grew ever bolder in his own conduct, ever more secure in his sense of personal supremacy, and ever more inclined to let his famously sharp tongue run precisely where it pleased him, regardless of the target. A man who has built an entire career on delivering devastating remarks does not always reliably know when to hold one back, and the temptation to be genuinely witty even at the direct expense of the grandest possible target could, on occasion, prove simply too strong to resist entirely. And so, gradually, the friendship curdled, cooling first into visible distance, and then, before long, into open and unmistakable hostility between the two men. The precise details of the eventual falling out matter rather less than the truly spectacular manner in which the dandy ultimately chose to acknowledge it publicly. At a crowded, thoroughly fashionable gathering, finding himself deliberately snubbed by the prince, who pointedly greeted a mutual companion standing nearby while entirely ignoring the dandy himself, the dandy refused outright to absorb the calculated insult in polite silence. Instead, in a single moment of genuinely breathtaking, almost suicidal audacity, he turned calmly to his companion and asked, loudly enough for the entire room to hear clearly, with the prince himself standing directly there listening, exactly who his rather stout friend might happen to be. It stood as the funniest line of his entire life, and very nearly, quite literally, the last genuinely funny thing his social position would ever permit him afterward. In that single devastating sentence, he had done the truly unthinkable, openly mocking the future king to his face regarding his weight, delivered before an audience composed of precisely the people whose collective opinion made and unmade reputations across London. The very wit that had carried him steadily to the absolute top had now, in one careless instant, aimed itself directly at the one target no amount of cleverness could realistically survive. A joke made at the expense of a rival cost essentially nothing. A joke made at the direct expense of the heir to the throne, delivered straight to his face, amounted to a genuinely fatal miscalculation dressed up, however briefly, as a personal triumph. The room itself may have laughed, or gasped audibly, or quite possibly done both simultaneously. But the powerful, as a general rule, do not readily forget such things, and a future king possesses both a notoriously long memory and a genuinely heavy hand when eventually provoked. The dandy had, in that single reckless moment, effectively lit the fuse leading to his own eventual destruction, and the resulting explosion, when it finally came, would be measured not in further laughter but in accumulating debt, forced exile, and a fall from grace, every bit as complete as his earlier rise had been genuinely dazzling to witness. We have laughed together about the unpaid tailors and the catastrophic gambling losses along the way, but now, finally, the bill comes properly due, in every conceivable sense of that phrase. The entire dandy lifestyle amounted, from the very beginning, to a magnificent structure built almost entirely on borrowed money and steadily borrowed time. The clothes, the boots, the rented rooms, the horses, the jeweled snuff boxes, the endless bottles of fine wine, all of it flowed in continuously on credit, extended generously by tradesmen who simply assumed a fashionable gentleman was reliably good for the eventual payment. And for a considerable while, the whole comfortable illusion genuinely held together without much strain. It is worth pausing here, just once, to properly tally up the sheer accumulated cost of being a dandy, because the underlying numbers were genuinely ruinous, even for men who had originally started out with real, substantial fortunes behind them. Every single element of the life we have carefully described across this evening carried its own real price tag, and often a genuinely staggering one at that. The tailoring alone could reasonably consume an entire fortune on its own, and the dandy, remember, never ordered merely one coat but many, steadily replaced as fashion shifted around him, or simply as an existing garment lost its perfect, pristine freshness after too many wearings. Add to that the boots, the endless daily changes of fresh linen, the pairs of gloves casually discarded at the very first faint smudge, the fine wine consumed nightly, the jeweled snuff boxes collected obsessively, the horses and elegant carriages maintained at enormous expense, the fashionable rooms rented at exactly the right address, and finally the accumulated gambling losses piled directly on top of everything else. And you arrive at a genuine torrent of ongoing expense with no corresponding source of actual income whatsoever, because the true dandy, by the very definition of his chosen identity, simply did not work for a living. This represents the fatal flaw sitting right at the heart of the entire glittering enterprise. The dandy's whole personal brand rested on leisure itself, his entire carefully constructed identity built around the pose that he did not toil, did not earn, did not sully himself in any way with anything so common as an actual livelihood. But money that never comes in must, inevitably, eventually run out completely, and a man who spends lavishly while earning absolutely nothing is, quite simply, steadily drawing down a reservoir that possesses no renewable source whatsoever. For those who had genuinely begun with substantial family fortunes, that particular reservoir might reasonably last for years, creating a convincing, sustained illusion of essentially endless available wealth. But it drained away all the same, quietly and steadily, while the actual spending itself never meaningfully slowed down even for a moment. The whole precarious system was propped up entirely by credit, by the ongoing willingness of individual tradesmen to supply valuable goods immediately against nothing more than the polite promise of eventual future payment. And that particular willingness, as we saw clearly with the tailor's own situation, rested almost entirely on reputation and hope rather than on any solid underlying guarantee whatsoever. A fashionable gentleman was generally assumed, by default, to be genuinely good for his outstanding bills, and so the coats and the boots and the fine wine kept arriving steadily, the accumulated debts mounting quietly in ledgers scattered all across London, while the dandy himself floated serenely along above it all, carefully refusing to think too hard about anything quite so vulgar as what he actually owed. But creditors, however patient they might initially appear, are never genuinely saintly in the end, and the polite social fiction sustaining the whole arrangement could not possibly last forever. As the unpaid bills went steadily unpaid, and the accumulated sums grew increasingly monstrous, the tradesmen's patience gradually curdled into something considerably harder and less forgiving. The creditors, politely referred to at the time as duns, began to press their claims more insistently, and their pressing grew noticeably less polite with every passing season that went by. A man might eventually find himself actively dodging his own bootmaker in the open street, deliberately avoiding certain shops entirely, growing genuinely skilled over time in the rather undignified art of simply not being wherever his creditors happened to expect him to be. The once magnificent, perpetually serene dandy, reduced now to something closer to a fugitive fleeing from the very men who had originally dressed him so beautifully. And behind these steadily mounting debts loomed a genuinely terrifying prospect for any man who could not eventually settle what he owed. This was, after all, an age possessing a genuinely merciless remedy for debtors unable to pay. A man could be legally seized and thrown into prison, locked away indefinitely and held there until his outstanding debts were somehow, some way settled in full, a fate capable of trapping a man for years, since it proves remarkably difficult to earn one's way back out of anything meaningful from inside a debtor's cell. This particular shadow fell across even the very grandest figures of fashion, the constant, nagging knowledge that beneath all the accumulated glory, one sufficiently determined creditor and a single unpaid bill could bring the entire shining edifice crashing down into a prison cell. The clock, in other words, was always quietly ticking away in the background, and for the man who had once mocked a future king to his face and gambled away an entire fortune across the card tables, it was ticking now very loudly indeed. When the accumulated debts finally, inevitably overwhelmed him, and the powerful enemies he had carelessly made along the way gathered themselves properly, there remained only one genuine road still open before him, and it led directly out of England entirely. And here, finally, is precisely where the fairy tale collapses completely. For all his considerable wit, all his refined taste, all his practiced mastery over dukes and even princes, the dandy could not realistically sneer his way past his own accumulated debts forever. When the gambling losses eventually piled too high, and the assembled creditors closed steadily in from every direction, there was, in the end, often only one genuine exit remaining open to him, and it was very far from a graceful one. Under cover of quiet, the most legendary dandy of the entire age simply fled the country outright, slipping quietly across the Channel to France in order to escape the debtor's prison patiently waiting for him back at home. Let us properly sit with the sheer completeness of this collapse for a moment, because it is genuinely staggering when you examine it directly. Here stood the very man who had once ruled the whole of fashionable London, who had personally made and unmade entire reputations from a single club window, who had confidently dictated the correct tilt of every hat and the precise fold of every neckcloth across the city, who had counted the future king himself among his closest personal friends, and had dared, in one reckless moment, to mock him openly to his face. He had stood, quite literally, at the absolute summit of the entire social world, feared and openly admired and endlessly copied by the greatest men in the entire land. And now, that very same man was creeping quietly out of the country under cover of darkness, running desperately from ordinary tradesmen's bills exactly like any common debtor, because that, stripped entirely of all its accumulated glamour, was precisely and exactly what he had finally become. The flight itself amounted to a shabby, thoroughly undignified affair, the complete opposite of everything the dandy had spent his entire adult life carefully projecting outward. There was no grand, ceremonial departure whatsoever, no farewell extended to admiring crowds of any kind, only a quiet, careful slipping away designed specifically to avoid both the creditors and the very real prison sentence awaiting any man who genuinely could not pay what he owed. He crossed the water to France, settling eventually in modest port towns and considerably cheaper lodgings, where a fleeing Englishman might reasonably live safely beyond the practical reach of those he still owed money to back home. And the Channel itself effectively became his personal moat, not designed to keep any enemies safely out, but rather to keep himself permanently from being dragged back across to answer properly for his own accumulated ruin. He was, it should be said clearly, far from entirely alone in taking this particular road out of the country. The continent gradually became a genuine refuge for an entire class of fashionable Englishmen who had spent themselves thoroughly into complete disaster, gentlemen who had lived considerably too well for considerably too long, and paid out entirely too little along the way, finally running out simultaneously of both available money and plausible excuses. They traded the glittering ballrooms and exclusive clubs of London for quiet foreign towns and steadily dwindling funds, effectively exiled from the very society they had once so thoroughly adorned, living out the remainder of their days in a considerably reduced, noticeably faded version of the splendor they had once genuinely known firsthand. The glittering life they had all pursued so eagerly claimed a great many such casualties along the way, men who had shone brilliantly for a time, and then simply vanished quietly across the water into lasting obscurity. What makes this particular story cut so sharply, even now, is the sheer distance separating the carefully constructed public image from the private underlying reality. On the surface, the dandy embodied wealth, refined taste, and an almost effortless sense of personal superiority, a man who seemed to float comfortably above all ordinary, common cares of the world. Beneath that carefully maintained surface, however, lay unpaid bills accumulating steadily, mounting private terror, and finally, inevitably, outright flight. The channel he crossed quietly under cover of darkness measured, better than perhaps anything else could, the true gap between what the dandy had so carefully appeared to be and what he had in cold reality actually become underneath it all. The considerable space between the dazzling public performance and the genuinely desperate private truth hiding just beneath its surface. For the very greatest among these fallen dandies, exile represented not merely a temporary setback to be weathered, but rather the genuine beginning of a long, slow, quiet ending. The man who had crossed the water specifically to escape his mounting debts would never come triumphantly sweeping back home again in glory. He would remain abroad indefinitely, his once considerable fortune entirely gone, his former glory steadily fading into distant memory, watched only from a considerable distance as the very society he had once so thoroughly commanded simply moved on comfortably without him. The performance, in every meaningful sense, was now genuinely over, and no amount of remaining wit, no perfectly tied neckcloth, no flawlessly cut coat could ever hope to summon back the glittering world he had irretrievably lost. And so we arrive, finally, at the last act of our story tonight, the genuinely quiet and rather sad conclusion of a life lived so brilliantly across its surface, and the surprisingly enduring legacy these ultimately ruined men somehow managed to leave behind them regardless. So how does the full story actually end? Not particularly well, it must be said honestly, for the great majority of these men. The single greatest dandy of the entire age, once the close personal friend of a king and the acknowledged terror of high society, eventually died far from London, entirely penniless and thoroughly broken, his once brilliant mind largely gone, his considerable fortune long since gambled and steadily borrowed away into absolutely nothing at all. It stands as a genuinely grim finale for a man who had once lived so brilliantly, so entirely on the glittering surface of things. Trace carefully the full shape of that particular fall, and it becomes almost genuinely unbearable in its sheer completeness. The man who had once stood at the very center of the entire fashionable world, whose personal approval the powerful had openly begged for, whose casual remarks had traveled across the whole of society within days, ended his own days instead in quiet exile, genuinely poor, entirely forgotten by the very glittering crowd that had once hung eagerly on his every single word. The once famous wit dimmed steadily over time, his health gradually failed him, and in the very end, even the sharp, celebrated mind that had originally made him so famous slipped quietly away from him entirely. He who had lived his entire life for open admiration died, in the end, with almost no one at all watching, in circumstances every bit as modest and mean as his earlier heyday had been genuinely magnificent by comparison. The sheer distance separating the glittering beginning of his story from its quiet, sad end amounts to the whole moral lesson buried within it. And he was, it should be said clearly, very far from alone in this particular pattern of ruin. This represented, in the end, the fairly common fate shared by the entire breed. The relentless gambling, the endless borrowing, the constant spending pursued relentlessly in service of an image that ultimately produced no actual income whatsoever, all of it led, man after man in turn, to broadly the same grim eventual destinations: crushing debt, forced exile, public disgrace, and sometimes a genuinely lonely, diminished death, far removed from the glittering scenes of their earlier personal triumphs. They had burned brilliantly, certainly, but also rather briefly, and burning that brilliantly, it turns out, is a genuinely expensive way to live one's entire life. The fashionable world itself simply moved steadily on, exactly as it always eventually does, and the individual men who had once ruled it so completely gradually faded instead into quiet cautionary tales told to later generations. And yet here, buried within all that considerable wreckage, sits a genuinely strange, quiet kind of triumph, the one thing that ultimately redeems this whole absurd, ruinous enterprise when examined honestly from a proper distance. The dandies lost their money, certainly, lost many of their friends along the way, and in some documented cases lost their very minds by the end. But they won something else entirely, something they could never possibly have imagined at the time and in most cases never lived long enough to fully see for themselves. They permanently changed the way men dress, and in doing precisely that, they managed to reach out from their own doomed particular era and quietly shape every single generation that followed them afterward. Remember carefully the great underlying revolution of the code itself, the deliberate rejection of gaudy excess in favor of dark, sober, perfectly cut restraint instead. Remember the genuine obsession with fit over mere decoration, with true immaculate cleanliness, with the core underlying idea that real elegance lives in quiet perfection rather than in loud, obvious display. These were never simply passing fashions destined to die quietly along with the men who first invented them. They became, instead, the very foundation underlying modern men's wear as we understand it today. The core underlying principles behind the properly tailored suit, the crisp white dress shirt, the whole broader notion that a genuinely well-cut garment in a quiet, understated color represents the height of a certain particular kind of style. Every single man who has ever felt the quiet, private confidence that comes from a suit fitting him absolutely perfectly owes a small, entirely unknowing debt to these vain, ultimately ruined men from 2 centuries past. The underlying instinct they originally pioneered runs considerably deeper still than mere clothing choices alone. That whole familiar idea, so thoroughly ingrained in us now that we tend to forget it ever actually had to be invented in the first place, that genuine elegance whispers quietly while cheap taste generally shouts loudly, that the single most confident presence in any given room is very often, in practice, the simplest one present. That real restraint can prove considerably more powerful than obvious display. All of this traces back directly to these particular men and their fierce competitive contempt for the gaudy peacocks who had confidently strutted before them. They taught the entire world a genuine lesson in style that the world, remarkably, never quite managed to unlearn afterward. So there is something almost genuinely poetic buried in this final reckoning, when you step back and consider it properly. They bankrupted themselves entirely chasing an essentially impossible standard of perfection, ruined their own lives thoroughly in pursuit of being properly admired, and paid for their considerable vanity with essentially everything they had to give. But in the accumulated wreckage of all those wasted fortunes, they accidentally, almost by pure historical accident, went ahead and dressed the future. And the future has continued wearing their original idea ever since, never quite knowing, in most cases, precisely whom to properly thank for it. So there you have it, a single full day in the life of a Regency dandy, and what a beautifully exhausting day it genuinely was. You woke that morning in rented rooms you could not honestly afford and spent hours afterward carefully becoming presentable. Scrubbed and shaved and plucked with real precision, laced tightly into whalebone until the room itself began gently swimming before your eyes, wrestled firmly into a coat you could barely manage to bend in properly, and did quiet battle with a strip of starched cloth that left an entire small snowdrift of failures scattered across your dressing room floor. You strolled unhurried so the whole city could properly admire you. You ruled comfortably from a window and quietly destroyed certain rivals with nothing more than a single deliberately turned shoulder. You starved yourself with real elegance, gambled away entire fortunes with an easy, practiced smile still fixed in place, polished your boots with actual champagne while simultaneously dodging the very men who had originally made them for you, and in one reckless, unforgettable moment, mocked a future king directly to his face. And for all of that, for all that dazzling, ultimately ruinous effort expended across an entire lifetime, most of these particular men ended their days in genuine debt, in forced exile, in quiet obscurity far removed from the glittering rooms they had once so thoroughly commanded. But there remains something oddly moving, even now, in simply considering how hard they genuinely tried. They chased an impossible perfection relentlessly until it finally bankrupted them completely. And in the resulting wreckage, almost entirely by accident, they managed to teach the whole world that true elegance genuinely does whisper rather than shout. Every well-cut coat worn by anyone since carries within it a faint, lingering echo of their considerable vanity and their genuine, if largely unintentional, genius. So tonight, as you settle comfortably into a bed you can actually genuinely afford, wearing clothes you can breathe freely in, with a full stomach and no anxious creditors waiting at your door, perhaps spare a gentle, quiet thought for those beautiful, thoroughly doomed men from 2 centuries past. They suffered magnificently, in their own particular way, purely so they could be properly admired, and somehow, despite everything that eventually happened to them, they still seem to find the whole strange enterprise genuinely worth pursuing, because history itself is often vain and reckless, and just a little bit ridiculous when you look closely enough. But it also stands as proof that people will reliably endure almost anything at all for one brief, shining moment spent standing in the light. Rest easy now. You have nothing whatsoever left to prove tonight, and nowhere in particular that you need to be.